Legs United. Up for the Cup and Spot the Ball by Alan Durant. Read by Richard Mitchley. Chapter 1. Exciting News. "Tottenham!" Sam Legg screeched. "We've drawn Tottenham Hotspur at home!" She danced about the sitting room as if her team, Muddington Rovers, had won the cup rather than just being drawn against a top Premier League team in round 3. Her older brother, Dan Legg, was excited too. He sat on the sofa with a broad grin on his round, freckly face. "Tottenham Hotspur at home," he repeated dreamily. It seemed almost too good to be true. Suddenly, his grin slipped into an anxious frown. "Do you think we'll get tickets?" he said, tugging at his ear. "You bet," declared Sam. "I wouldn't miss this match for the world." She tossed her head emphatically. "Anyway," she said, "Dad says that people who turn up to support regularly go to the front of the queue for cup tickets." Sam and Dan often went to see Muddington Rovers play. Usually they went with their dad, Stephen Legg, and their younger twin brothers, Giles and Justin. Sometimes their cousin, Zach Brown, Dan's best friend, went too. He lived in the same street as Sam and Dan. A third set of cousins lived in the house next door to them. The children of all 3 families were football mad and had formed a team called Legs United. "We'll have to get Archie to come too," said Sam, running her hand over her short red hair. "Yeah, well, it's easy for him, isn't it?" said Dan. "He doesn't need a ticket." Archie, alias Archibald Legg, was the children's great-great-uncle, deceased. He had once been a player for Muddington Rovers, but after being struck down by lightning, he had become a ghost. For over 60 years, he'd been trapped inside an old ball in the Leggs' loft, until quite by chance, Sam and Dan had released him. Now he was the manager of Legs United. "Let's call him up and tell him the great news," said Sam. "Good idea," Dan agreed. The 2 children went over to the glass-fronted cabinet which housed the old football, flanked by a pair of ancient leather shin guards. Sam lifted the ball out and started to rub it gently. Then, as if she were Aladdin summoning the genie from his magic lamp, she wailed, "Archie! Arise, oh Archie!" Her words had an immediate and dramatic effect. There was a fizz and a flash, and a ghostly figure whooshed out of the ball into the room. He stood shimmering and sparkling from head to toe like tinsel on a Christmas tree. For a moment, the 2 children stared at the phantom footballer, taking in the knotted red neckerchief, the old black and green striped Muddington Rovers shirt, the long, baggy white shorts, the thick green socks that concealed bulky shin pads, and the clumpy leather football boots with steel toe caps. As ever, Archie's skin was almost transparently pale, and contrasted with the bright red of his bushy caterpillar eyebrows, enormous walrus moustache, and flaming shock of hair. Around him there was a ghostly glow. I feel in fine fettle," he announced, with an extravagant waggle of his moustache. "That new contraption of your mother's is really most invigorating." "Eh?" Dan uttered, puzzled. "Archie charged himself up on Mum's new sewing machine," Sam explained, giggling. "Mum was making one of her dresses at the time, right? Suddenly, the machine went completely crazy, and Mum stitched the dress material to the sleeve of her jumper. She was really mad." "Yes, well, just a minor accident," Archie burbled. "These things happen with electricity." Archie had discovered that if he focused on something electrical, it boosted his ghostly energy. Right now, he was ablaze with it. "In my day, of course," he went on, "we relied a lot more on gas. Gas, is far more dependable." Dan quickly interrupted before Archie could launch into one of his lectures about the old days. "Archie, we've got something important to tell you," he cried. "Muddington Rovers have drawn Tottenham Hotspur in the cup." Archie showed no excitement. In fact, he met the news with a look of cool disdain. "Tottenham, eh?" he sniffed. "Well, Muddington should make mincemeat of a minor team like that." Sam and Dan stared at Archie once more, this time in total astonishment. "Tottenham aren't minor," said Dan at last. "They're one of the biggest clubs in the country." Now it was Archie's turn to show astonishment. "Tottenham? A big club?" he queried. Why, in my day they were a very minor outfit indeed. They weren't even in the top division." He paused an instant, raising his thick eyebrows. "But then, of course, in my day every club was minor compared to the great Herbert Chapman's Arsenal." Sam and Dan looked at one another and rolled their eyes. Archie was always going on about the Arsenal side of the 1930s and its manager, Herbert Chapman. If he'd mentioned them once, he'd mentioned them 1,000 times. "Well, anyway, Archie," Dan said, changing the subject back to the present, "Tottenham are a very big team now." "But Muddington Rovers are still going to beat them," said Sam, with a defiant toss of her head. "Tommy Banks will tear them apart." Well, strange things happen in the cup, laddie," Archie stated calmly. Usually Sam corrected Archie when he called her laddie, but right now she was too busy dreaming of her hero Tommy Banks, Muddington Rovers' star striker. "Tell me," continued Archie, "when is this great match to take place?" "The day after our cup match against Amberley Park," Dan informed his ghostly relative. The cup in question was the Muddington District Junior Cup. Amberley Park were Legs United's opponents in the first round. "We'll thrash them," Sam chirped, and she started dancing around the room again. Archie shook his head and sighed. Chapter 2. Mountains and Molehills. On Friday the following week, Dan came back from school with exciting news. "I'm going to the match!" he cried, bursting into the kitchen where his family were about to eat their tea. "That's nice, dear," said Anne Legg, putting a plate of hot crumpets on the table. "Which match is that?" "The cup match!" Dan exclaimed. "Muddington against Tottenham! We're going to be guests of honour, Mr. Barnard said." Mr. Barnard was the teacher in charge of Muddington Primary's school football team. At the end of football practice that afternoon, as Dan now explained, he had given his team the news that they had all been invited to the cup match against Tottenham. They were going as the special guests of Muddington Rovers' new chairman, who was an old boy of Muddington Primary. They'd watch the game from the hospitality seats in the central stand and be introduced to all the players. "You lucky devil," said Sam enviously. Her green eyes narrowed in a grumpy glare. "It's not fair. I should go too." "But you're not in the team," Dan reminded her. "I ought to be," Sam grumbled. It was a rule at Muddington Primary that only children in the top class could play for the school team. "Well, you will be next year," said Anne Legg soothingly. "But that's no good, is it?" Sam complained. "I want to be in the team now and meet the Muddington players with Dan and Zach and Zoe." Zach Brown and Zoe Legg were both in the top class, like Dan, and played for the school team. "I'll get Tommy Banks's autograph," Dan offered. But Sam was not pacified. She grunted, wrinkling her small nose disgustedly. She was still sulking the next day, when Legs United gathered for their Saturday morning training session with Archie. There were a couple of things he wanted to sort out before their league match that afternoon against Marchmont Road Juniors. It was Legs United's first ever season in the Muddington Junior League, a local football league for under-12s. So far they were doing well and had won most of their matches. They'd already played Marchmont Road Juniors away and beaten them, so they expected to win the return game at home. Legs United's home ground was a meadow at the bottom of the gardens of number 15 and number 17 Poplar Street, owned by the Legg family. They played all their home matches there, and they trained there too. The meadow had been turned into a football pitch during the last week of the summer holidays by the Leggs and Browns themselves, under the critical eye of Archie. The phantom coach was always quick to point out any fault he found with the playing surface. He was standing now in the centre circle, frowning at a bump on the pitch. It looked suspiciously like a molehill. "Moles," he tutted. "What confounded creatures they are!" His remark drew an immediate reaction from Sam. "I think they're nice," she retorted fiercely. "Only because they're small and chubby and they remind you of Tommy Banks," teased Dan. Sam gave her older brother a scorching look. "Tommy Banks isn't small or chubby," she hissed. "He's well built, with a low centre of gravity, like lots of great players." Very true, Archie agreed. "Take Alex James, the great Arsenal playmaker, for example." "And Maradona," said Zach, who knew a lot about football facts and figures. He was short and stocky, and my dad says he was the best player in the world when Argentina last won the World Cup." "Indeed," said Archie. He wrinkled his enormous moustache. "However, that still doesn't make me think any better of moles. To me, they're like bad referees." "Moles aren't like referees," the twins exclaimed together. "Indeed they are," Archie corrected them. "But how?" Dan inquired. "Well," said Archie, "they're blind, useless, and a menace to all around them." Most of the children laughed, but Sam screwed up her freckly nose in distaste. "Well, I think, Archie," she said sharply, "that you're making a mountain out of a molehill." "Ah, you won't say that when this whole pitch is covered in bumps," Archie insisted, "and the ball is bobbling about like a boy in a hurricane." He raised one pale, bony finger. "No, if this continues, something will have to be done. We cannot have our cup match ruined by a bumpy playing field." "We could get them with our catapults," Giles suggested. "Yes," added Justin, "or with my super soaker water gun." "Don't you dare," said Sam angrily. "You leave them alone." She glowered at the twins, then turned towards Archie and Dan, both of whom were smiling. "I think you're horrible," she exploded. Then she stormed away across the meadow. Chapter 3. Sam in a Sulk. The match against Marchmont Road Juniors turned out to be harder than Legs United had anticipated. The visitors had acquired some good players since the teams had last played, and they were much stronger. In addition, with Sam still sulking and hardly getting involved in the game at all, Legs United were a lot weaker. At half-time, the score was 0-0, but Marchmont had had the better chances. 2 fine saves by Gabby and a header off the line by Dan were all that had kept the score sheet blank. During the half-time break, Sam refused to speak to anyone. She sat on her own away from the rest of the team. She wouldn't even talk to her mum or dad. "Come on, Sam, this is stupid," Dan pleaded, but Sam ignored him. "Leave her be, laddie," Archie advised. "She'll come round." Herbert Chapman, Archie told his captain, had had countless rows with his great playmaker Alex James, but it had always worked out all right in the end. On one occasion, before an important cup tie, he recalled, the great manager had had to haul his star player out of bed to get him to play. "But patience is a great virtue in these instances," he declared with a small twitch of his moustache. Dan's patience with his sister was sorely tried in the second half. She didn't like tackling at the best of times, but against Marchmont she made no attempt at all to win the ball. Time after time, the opposing midfield players ran past her unchallenged. Dan and his fellow defenders had to work really hard to cover for her. What really annoyed Dan, though, was that even when he gave Sam the ball, she didn't use it properly. Normally she was brilliant on the ball. She dribbled past opponents and passed cleverly. She was, in Archie's words, the fulcrum of the team, the creator of most of Legs United's attacks. There was one move in particular that Archie liked to employ. It was based on a classic Arsenal tactic devised by Herbert Chapman, in which the ball was moved from defence to midfield to the wing and back into the central striker in a matter of seconds. Legs United had used the tactic successfully often in their matches so far. But in the game against Marchmont, the move never got going, thanks to Sam. In fact, she didn't play a decent pass in the whole match. She kept trying to run with the ball on her own. Finally, with a quarter of an hour left, matters came to a head. Dan passed the ball to Sam just outside his own penalty area, and half-heartedly she tried to go past 2 opponents. They robbed her easily and bore down on the Legs United goal. Dan and his defenders were outnumbered. The ball was passed among the attacking Marchmont players and found one of their strikers unmarked on the edge of the 6-yard box. Fortunately for Legs United, his shot was a bad one. The ball seemed to take a bobble as he hit it, and his shot rolled against the post and behind for a goal kick. Dan was furious. "Look, if you're going to give the ball away like that, you might as well get off the pitch," he shouted at Sam, his round face red with anger. Sam glared back. "OK then, I will," she shouted. "See how you get on without me." She turned and started to walk from the pitch. In a flash, Archie was there beside her. "Come on, laddie, I mean lassie," he quickly corrected himself. "You can't desert your team now. They need you." No, they don't, Sam retorted sharply. Dan just said so. You mustn't take to heart what's said in the heat of the moment, Archie persisted, flashing his young relative a gleaming smile. He flourished his moustache indulgently. Why, I remember the Arsenal skipper, Herbie Roberts, giving Alex James a terrible earful and— But Sam butted in before he could get any further. I don't give a stuff about your old players, Archie, she snapped harshly. I'm not playing any more, and that's final. And for the second time that day, she stormed from the meadow. Chapter 4. Grumps and Grudges. Somehow, through desperate defending and a piece of skillful finishing by Zack, a 10-man Legs United managed to beat Marchmont by 1-0. However, the atmosphere at number 15 Poplar Street in the days that followed was far from happy. Dan and Sam were not speaking to one another, and if Sam spoke to anyone else, it was usually with a grunt or a snarl. Sam was especially snappy with the twins, whose latest hobby, playing the recorder, was driving her crazy. Dan had some sympathy with her over this. He found their playing unbearable too. It wasn't just that they were very bad and very loud, it was that they each played a different tune. The cacophony that came from their room was 10 times worse than an alley full of fighting tomcats. It certainly did nothing to improve harmony in the Legg household. Anne and Stephen Legg did their best to smooth things over. So too did Zack, but without success. Dan was willing to make up with his sister if she made the first move, but there seemed no chance of that. Sam was set into a major sulk. She wasn't the only one either. Archie was also in a grump. When Dan summoned him from the ball, he smouldered and flickered like hot ashes. He wouldn't speak to Sam, he said, until she apologised to him for her rudeness. Herbert Chapman was never treated like this, he declared moodily. But I thought you said he often had rows with Alex James, Dan reminded his ghostly ancestor. Ah, yes, well, Archie mumbled. That was different. Alex James was a great star. Your sister's, well, he wrinkled his moustache critically. She's just a temperamental girl. Don't I know it, sighed Dan bitterly. He was glad, though, that Sam wasn't in the room to hear Archie's remark. Sparks really would have flown. It was a difficult few days for Legs United. The feud between Sam and Dan and Archie disrupted the team's preparations for their important cup match against Amberley Park. Archie refused to hold any training sessions until everything was sorted out. He wouldn't even discuss tactics with his team. But Archie, you're our coach, Dan protested. And this is our biggest match yet. We need you. Coach I may be. Whipping boy I am not, Archie sniffed. You can tell your sister that. Dan looked at his phantom relative in bewilderment. But I don't even know what it means, he said, tugging at one ear. Archie drew himself up and glowered at his captain. It means that I will not be spoken to as your sister spoke to me, he pronounced huffily. Then, quick as a mole down a hole, he vanished into the old ball. The following afternoon, after school, Dan and Zack went down to the meadow to practice. It seemed odd, though, not having Sam there too. Dan even missed her jibes about his shooting ability. The truth was, he wasn't the sort to hold grudges, and his anger with Sam soon passed. He actually felt quite sorry for her. It was a shame that she wasn't going with him and his cousins to meet the Muddington Rovers players, especially as she was such a big fan of Tommy Banks. By Tuesday evening, he decided that something just had to be done. We can't let this go on any longer, he told Zack, as the two of them walked back from the meadow. We've got to get Archie and Sam talking to one another again, or we won't be properly prepared for Saturday's match. But how are we going to do that? Zack asked, his face hidden behind curly strands of black hair. I don't know, Dan confessed with a sigh. But if Sam's still sulking when I get back from school tomorrow, then I'm going up to her room, and I'm not going to leave until she's seen sense. He frowned grimly, and remembering Archie's story about Herbert Chapman hauling Alex James out of bed, he added decisively, I'm going to get her back on the pitch, even if I have to drag her. Chapter 5. Mr. Barnard's Bombshell. By the time Dan returned from school with Zack the next afternoon, Sam's grump seemed the least of his worries. Something had happened that made everything else fade from his mind. Mr. Barnard had dropped a bombshell. "Whatever's the matter?" Annleg asked, seeing the look of dejection on Dan and Zack's faces. "You two look awful." "We've had some bad news," said Dan. "Terrible," sighed Zack. The two boys dropped their sports bags on the hall floor as if they were discarding all hope. "Well, come into the sitting room and tell me about it," Annleg cajoled. Dan called up Archie so that he could hear the bad news too. "Mr. Barnard has arranged an away trip for Saturday afternoon," Dan revealed wretchedly. "It's at some private school down near the coast. Apparently the football teacher there is a friend of his. He had a little tournament planned, but one of the teams had to pull out at the last moment. So he asked Mr. Barnard if Muddington Primary would step in." Dan scowled. "I reckon old Barnard only wants to go to show off to his mate about going to the cup game against Tottenham." Archie peered at Dan with a puzzled air. "This is all very interesting," he muttered, "but I fail to see the problem. You are already playing in a match on Saturday against Amberley Park. Your Mr. Barnard, Dan corrected him. "Your Mr. Barnard," Archie continued, "will simply have to replace you and Zack and Zoe with 3 reserves." Dan and Zack looked at each other and sighed. "It's not that simple, Archie," Dan informed his phantom ancestor. "We told Barnard about our game, didn't we, Zack?" Zack nodded in a flurry of ringlets. "We did," he confirmed. "He said we had to play. The school comes first, he said." "If we don't play, we can't go to the match on Sunday," Dan added glumly. "Well, that's not right," said Annleg sharply. "I'll have a word with him." But Dan quickly shook his head. "There's no point, Mum," he said hopelessly. "He won't change his mind. He never does." "Even when he's totally wrong," Zack remarked with unusual bite. "Like now," said Dan. Archie muttered with deep disapproval. "He sounds like a very poor manager indeed. The ability to admit one's mistakes is an essential requirement of good management." The two children looked a little quizzically at their own manager. They'd never heard him admit he was wrong about anything. "He isn't a good manager," said Dan. He shrugged, then tugged disconsolately at his ear. "But that's not the point. He's our manager, and what he says goes." He puffed out his round cheeks with a resigned air. "So, either we play for Legs United against Amberley Park and don't go to the match against Tottenham and meet all the Muddington Rovers players." He paused and sighed. "Or we don't play against Amberley, go with the school team on Saturday instead, and see the match on Sunday." "A dilemma indeed," Archie mused, caressing his moustache with great care. "Well, we've already decided what we're going to do, haven't we, Zack?" Dan said gloomily. Zack nodded. "We talked about it on the way home from school," he said. "What are you going to do?" Annleg inquired. "We're going to play against Amberley Park, of course," Dan replied limply. "We couldn't let our family down." It was a noble gesture, but neither Zack nor Dan looked any the better for making it. In football speak, they looked as sick as parrots. "Well," Dan continued wearily, "I guess I'd better go and talk to Sam. At least she's got one less reason to be grumpy with me now, hasn't she?" He smiled grimly, but as he walked out of the room, his eyes were near to tears. Chapter 6. Legs Reunited. Dan knocked on Sam's door, his spirits drooping even further as he read the handwritten sign that hung from the door. "No boys allowed. Keep out. By order, Sam." "Who is it?" came the sharp response from the other side of the door. "It's me, Dan," said Dan softly. "I want to talk to you." "Well, I don't want to talk to you," Sam retorted sharply. "Go away." Dan opened the door anyway. "I said go away," Sam hissed as Dan walked into her room. Dan stood by the door and gazed in at his sister. She was lying on her bed reading a football magazine. Next to her on the wall was a huge full-colour poster of Tommy Banks. "I'm not going away, Sam," Dan insisted. Not until we've talked. Sam sighed heavily and shrugged. Go on then, she said coolly. What have you got to say? Dan pulled at his ear tensely. Well, first, I wanted to say sorry, he began, for shouting at you in the match on Saturday. Huh, Sam grunted. She scowled at the magazine in front of her. Sam, Dan pleaded, we've got to all pull together. Otherwise we'll never have a chance against Amberley. We'll go out of the cup in the first round. I don't care, Sam growled, but Dan knew she did really. She wanted Legs United to do well in the cup more than anybody. He suddenly felt a surge of anger. He'd had enough of all this. Look, Sam, I'm giving up going to the Tottenham match to play against Amberley, he exploded. The least you can do is make up with me and Archie. Sam was about to respond, then stopped. She stared at Dan quizzically. What do you mean you're giving up the Tottenham match? She asked. Dan explained about Mr. Barnard's bombshell and what he and Zack had decided to do. That's so unfair, Sam said, her own grievances forgotten now. He can't stop you from going to the match. He can, Dan answered miserably. He has. He looked so downcast that Sam searched desperately for something to say that might cheer him up. You could sit with us, she suggested tentatively. Dad'll get you tickets. But Dan shook his head. There aren't any tickets left now, he replied unhappily. The game's sold out. I heard them say so on the radio this morning. Now Sam's face fell too. I'm sorry, Dan, she said. Yeah, Dan grunted. He looked down at the floor, his throat tightening, and breathed deeply. When he felt calmer, he turned again to the reason he'd come to Sam's room. So, you'll play on Saturday? Properly, I mean. You'll be our fulcrum again, our Alex James. Sam smiled. The great Alex James, she declared, in a voice that imitated Archie. Then she and Dan both laughed. Archie's still sulking, you know, Dan said. He hasn't forgiven you for telling him to stuff his old players. He's taken it as a personal insult. Sam wrinkled her small nose. I didn't mean it like that, she said. I was just angry, that's all. I know, said Dan, but could you tell Archie that? We need him to start coaching us again. Things are getting really desperate. Sam flicked back her fringe and nodded. Oh, okay, she sighed. He's downstairs now with Zack, Dan said. He glanced at the door to suggest they go and see. Sam put down her magazine and rolled off the bed. As she did so, a terrible squeaking started up along the landing. The twins had begun their evening recorder practice. Sam and Dan looked at one another and shook their heads, wincing at the awful combination of hot cross buns and jingle bells. They found Archie, with his foot on the old ball, in the middle of a story about an ancient FA Cup final. He glanced towards Sam and Dan as they entered the room, but continued with his tale. As ever, it involved Herbert Chapman. He was the manager of Huddersfield Town at the time, apparently, and they were playing Preston in the final. As I was saying, Archie intoned, with a nod at Zack, it was a dreadfully dull match until the 67th minute, when Huddersfield were awarded a penalty. Hamilton, the Preston fullback, brought down Billy Smith, the Huddersfield winger, on the edge of the penalty area. But was it inside or outside? Most people thought the latter, but the referee disagreed. Penalty, he said. Archie paused for a moment, and though he ignored Dan and Sam, Dan could tell he was pleased that his audience had now trebled in size. The goalkeeper was one J.F. Mitchell, Archie continued with a disapproving twitch of his great moustache, and he danced about on his line like an excited monkey begging for peanuts. It was quite ridiculous. His hairy eyebrows met in an upside-down V. I've heard of him, Zack said. Indeed, Archie queried with a gratified smile. He's the only goalie to wear glasses in a cup final, Zack stated proudly. Quite right. Archie congratulated his young relative. He did wear glasses. But he didn't save the penalty. Smith scored, and Huddersfield won the cup. Archie beamed at the memory. Another great day for Herbert Chapman, eh? Dan ventured lightly. Archie looked at Dan. A good day, certainly, he agreed. though of course his best days were yet to come. At Arsenal, Zack affirmed. Precisely, Archie nodded. With Alex James, Sam interjected. Then, having got the Phantom Coach's attention, she added quickly, I'm sorry for what I said the other day, Archie. Really I am. I was angry with Dan, not you. I know Alex James was a great player. Archie muttered. His eyebrows hopped and his moustache wiggled as he regarded his young playmaker. Well, apology accepted, he declared at last. Now we can commence with planning our own cup victory. Once we've sorted out this other unfortunate matter, of course. Sam's eyes sparked with outrage. It's not right, she cried suddenly. She gestured towards Dan and Zack. You were invited to the Tottenham match. You should be allowed to go. Try telling old Barnard that, Dan commented bitterly. There was silence for a moment. Then Archie gave a small cough. In the twilight, his ghostly figure gleamed and shimmered. Well, he announced decisively, that is precisely what I intend to do. Chapter 7. Ghost at School. The next morning, Archie accompanied the children to school. But Archie, Dan protested, Mr. Barnard won't be able to hear you if you do talk to him. Archie, it had been established, was only visible and audible to his own family, a state of affairs that had already caused him much frustration. Today, however, he was nonchalance itself as he floated along the street, his outline glowing brightly. Ah, trust me, he said mysteriously, tapping one bony finger to his nose. We spirits have ways of making ourselves understood. If you say so, Dan said with a despondent air. He didn't hold out much hope that Archie would be successful. He felt doomed to missing out on being a guest of honour at the Tottenham match. When they arrived at school, Archie went with Dan, Zack and Zoe towards their classroom. Good luck, Sam called as they walked away. Luck? Archie retorted with an extravagant waggle of his huge moustache. Who needs luck, laddie, when you have genius? Sam smiled and shook her head. I hope you're right, Archie, she said to herself. As he floated through the school, Archie had plenty to say about what he saw around him. For a start, there was the uniform. When he was a lad, he remarked, ties and blazers were obligatory. He didn't approve of the sweatshirts and tracksuit trousers that many of the children wore, but it was their shoes that drew his greatest criticism. In my day, he stated sternly, you could see your face in your shoes, they were so shiny. He glanced down proudly at the gleaming toe-caps of his own size 12 boots. I always kept my footwear in immaculate condition, he added, looking pointedly at Dan's shoes, which were scuffed and dull. My dad polishes my shoes once a week, Dan said defensively. Once a week, laddie? Archie exclaimed. Shoes should be polished every day. You should treat them like you treat your pet rabbit. But I don't have a pet rabbit, Dan replied, bemused. Well, all the more reason to look after your shoes, Archie insisted. But if he was critical of the pupils' dress, Archie was horrified at their teacher's appearance. Why, I've seen smarter tramps, he sniffed disgustedly as they passed a group of teachers in the corridor. The children burst out laughing, then quickly had to pretend they were coughing when the teachers glared at them. They came at last to the top classroom. Dan, Zack and Zoe sat at their tables, while Archie prowled about the room, peering reproachfully about him. When Mr. Barnard came in, Archie fixed him with a steely gaze. So this is your manager, he observed dismissively. As the teacher read the register, Archie wandered to the front of the class. He studied Mr. Barnard closely. Well, at least he's wearing a jacket and tie, he commented. He ran one finger lightly across the teacher's collar. Limp, he scolded. Not nearly enough starch. Mr. Barnard paused and glanced up from his book with a puzzled expression. He waggled his neck as if to get rid of some minor irritation. Zack and Zoe stared at Archie goggle-eyed, while Dan frowned and shook his head vigorously. Is something the matter, Daniel? Mr. Barnard demanded sharply. Dan froze. No, sir, he muttered. My neck was just a bit stiff. The teacher murmured. I trust it will unstiffen by Saturday. You are coming with us on Saturday, aren't you? He gave Dan a piercing look. Dan's head bowed. His heart thumped in his chest. "No, sir," he said quietly. "No?" Mr. Barnard queried. His small, deep-set eyes bored into Dan, who shuffled on his chair uneasily. "I can't go on the school trip, sir," Dan explained. "I've got to play for Legs United." "Really?" Mr. Barnard snorted. "And what about you, Zach? And Zoe?" The two children shook their heads. "We have to play for Legs United too," Zach said. "Very well, but you know the consequences," Mr. Barnard informed them. "If you don't come with the team on Saturday, you don't come on Sunday either." He raised his hands. "Right, that's my last word on the subject. Now let's get on." He picked up his pen to continue, but Archie tapped it from his fingers. The pen rolled across the teacher's desk and clattered onto the floor. "Now just a minute, sir," Archie remonstrated. He loomed over Mr. Barnard like a huge flame. "This matter is far from closed. These lads are playing for me on Saturday, and you have no right to punish them." He raised a finger like a referee giving a caution. "I demand that you reverse your decision," he boomed. It was an impressive performance, but wasted, of course. Mr. Barnard neither saw nor heard Archie. He picked up his pen, and after studying it a moment, he completed the register. "Right, class, maths book's out," he ordered. But Archie was far from finished. When Mr. Barnard got up and began to walk around the tables, Archie sat down in his seat and started writing. When Mr. Barnard returned to his desk, he looked down and frowned. Waves of deep wrinkles appeared on his large forehead, and his eyes looked hostile. "Daniel," he said, "I presume this is your work." He held up a piece of paper and read it out. "Dan, Zach and Zoe must be allowed to play for Legs United on Saturday without penalty. Signed, Archibald Legg, the Phantom of the Cup." "The Phantom of the Cup," Mr. Barnard repeated tartly. He glared at Dan. "Save your imagination for creative writing, Daniel. Any more nonsense like this, and I shall put you in detention this lunchtime." "But it wasn't me, sir," Dan complained. "Oh, I suppose it really was a ghost, was it?" Mr. Barnard mocked. Dan's body sagged. What was the point of trying to explain? Mr. Barnard would never believe him. Archie attempted to come to his young relative's assistance. "Leave the boy be," he rebuked, his eyes ablaze. "It was I, Archibald Legg, who wrote the note." As before, however, his words fell on deaf ears. For a while, Archie retreated to the windowsill, where he perched like some massive bird deep in thought. But he was determined to make himself heard, and he was soon up on his feet again. His next trick was truly spectacular. While Mr. Barnard was rummaging in a big storage cupboard and the children were busy with their maths, Archie picked up a piece of chalk and started writing on the blackboard, repeating his earlier message. Gradually, faces started to turn towards the blackboard, and an astonished gasp went round the room at the sight of a piece of chalk writing on its own. Mr. Barnard was the last to witness Archie's display. He appeared from the cupboard with a box of maths puzzles, just as Archie was signing his name. The teacher gaped, eyes boggling for an instant, his face draining of colour. He swallowed so hard that his Adam's apple bounced in his throat. The box of puzzles dropped from his hands and spilled noisily across the floor. The racket seemed to snap him out of his stupor. He turned to Dan with a furious expression. "I don't know how you did that, Daniel," he thundered, "but you can spend your lunch hour in here writing that message until you're as sick of the sight of it as I am." Dan closed his eyes in silent misery. Archie's antics had made things much worse, not better. The situation was hopeless. Chapter 8. Bad News and Good. Dan was the picture of gloom that afternoon as he told his family about his disastrous day at school and Archie's part in it. "Where is Archie?" Sam asked when he'd finished. Dan shrugged. "Back in his ball, I suppose," he said. "He disappeared at the end of school." "He's probably too embarrassed to show his face," Anne Legg remarked dryly, "after the mess he seems to have made of things." She ruffled Dan's hair comfortingly. "This whole business is very unfair," she said. I really think I ought to speak to Mr. Barnard. Dan shook his head at once. No, Mum, please, he begged. There's no point. He sighed. Besides, he's already said that if there's any more trouble, he'll drop me from the school team. Well, if you insist, Anne-Leg agreed reluctantly. But Julia will have a word with him, I'm sure. Julia Brown, Zach's mum, was a teacher at Muddington Primary. She won't, Dan said. Zach's asked her not to. After tea, Dan went round to the Browns to see his cousin. Sam, meanwhile, decided to call up Archie. It was his duty to sort things out, she reckoned. If he was such a genius, then he ought to do something to prove it, not skulk away inside that old pig's bladder that he inhabited. Archie, she wailed, gently rubbing the football. Arise, oh Archie! But nothing happened. She tried once more, with the same result. Archie, it seemed, had not yet returned from his outing to school. Before going to bed that evening, Sam made another attempt to summon Archie, but again without success. She looked anxiously at the old football in her hands. I hope he knows the way back, she thought. Then she wondered if ghosts could get lost. For an instant, she imagined herself putting up one of the notices that she'd seen on trees. Missing, black and white kitten named Fluffykins. Only her notice would read, Missing, phantom footballer named Archie. No one could see him, though, so they wouldn't be able to help find him, would they? She went to bed feeling quite concerned about her ghostly relative. Archie still hadn't returned next morning, when Sam tried once more to summon him. She told Dan of his continued absence on the way to school. Oh, that's all we need, Dan groaned. The day before our first ever cup match, and our coach goes missing. He looked so glum that Sam decided not to mention her worries that Archie might actually be lost. What seemed like further bad news awaited Dan on his arrival at school. He was to go at once to the office of Mrs. Samuels, the head teacher. What now? He wailed. Perhaps she's heard what's happened to you and wants to talk about it, Sam suggested hopefully. Then, less hopefully, she added, she might be on your side. Yeah, and pigs might fly, Dan muttered darkly. He went off to his interview with a face like stewed rhubarb. Yet when Sam next saw him, at morning break, he was grinning like Christmas Day. Beside him, Zach and Zoe were grinning too. What is it? She cried, unable to believe her eyes. What's happened? It's all sorted, Dan yelled, and he gave his sister a great hug. Oi, you're crushing me, Sam spluttered laughingly. Dan released his grip and put his arms round Zach and Zoe. We're going to Wembley! We're going to Wembley! He crooned happily. You're going to Wembley? Sam quizzed incredulously. Dan laughed. Well, we're going to Muddington Rovers against Tottenham anyway, he crowed. Then he explained how his fortunes had turned around so dramatically. The summons to Mrs. Samuel's office had not been to receive further bad news, quite the contrary. Mr. Barnard had phoned in sick that morning. He'd sounded very shaky indeed, the head teacher had said. However, he had been very concerned that a message should be given to Dan. It was this. Dan, Zach and Zoe were excused the school team trip the next day. Indeed, it seemed likely that the whole trip would be cancelled, Mrs. Samuels had said, for Mr. Barnard had sounded in a terrible state. But can we go to the Muddington Rovers game on Sunday? Dan had implored the head teacher anxiously. Yes, of course, Mrs. Samuels had assured him. Mr. Barnard was quite particular about that. Tell them I shall see them on Sunday, he said. Then she had sent Dan back to his classroom. So that's it. Everything's going to be all right after all, Dan rejoiced. Why do you think he changed his mind? Asked Zach. Who cares? Said Dan. He started singing again, and this time Zach and Zoe joined in. Sam watched them, a broad smile on her freckly face. But then a dark cloud blotted her sunshine. Everything wasn't yet all right, was it? Archie. What had happened to Archie? Chapter 9. Archie Goes A-Haunting. As it turned out, Sam need not have worried about Archie. Returning from school that afternoon, she, Dan and Zack immediately got out the old ball to call up their ghostly relative, and out he fizzed, glowing brighter than ever and looking extremely pleased with himself. "Greetings, lads," he declaimed heartily. "I take it that all is well."
"Archie," Sam exclaimed, "where on earth have you been?"
"I've been a-haunting," he replied mysteriously. "But first, have you any news to tell me?" Excitedly, Dan told Archie all about his meeting with Mrs. Samuels and the good tidings she had given him.
"I don't know what made old Barnard change his mind," Dan concluded with a shrug, "but he did. That's the important thing."
Archie's moustache waggled with amusement.
"I think I might know what made Mr. Barnard change his mind," he gloated.
The three children gazed hard at their phantom manager.
"Archie," Sam cried, "it was you! What did you do?" Dan inquired.
"I merely made your teacher see the error of his ways," Archie replied teasingly.
"Come on, Archie," Sam urged. "Tell us what happened, please."
"Very well," Archie intoned suavely. "Sit down, and all shall be revealed."
There was nothing Archie liked better than relating a story to an attentive audience. And no audience could have been more attentive than Sam, Zack, and Dan. They listened completely enthralled as he told them of his exploits the evening before. Having failed to make the desired impression on Mr. Barnard at school, Archie had decided he would have to follow his fellow manager home and there indulge in some serious haunting. It wasn't something he'd done much of, he explained, which is why his efforts in the classroom had not been more successful.
"Once I entered your Mr. Barnard's house, however, I soon mastered the technique," he said proudly. "And then, though I say it myself, I was rather good."
Usually these statements of self-praise brought groans from the children, but on this occasion they were too eager to hear what Archie had to say to interrupt.
"I began with some simple tricks," Archie continued. "Mr. Barnard hung up his coat. I knocked it off its peg and onto the floor. He picked it up, I knocked it off, and so it went on, up and down for some minutes, until he became irritated and I grew bored. Then we went into the kitchen, where the real fun began."
Archie paused, radiant at the memory.
"I opened cupboard doors. He closed them. I opened them again. He closed them. I opened them, and so on. Then I chucked a few things about the room, as we ghosts are wont to do."
"What sort of things?"
Dan asked, tugging at his ear.
"Oh, you know, rice, sugar, eggs, that sort of thing," Archie replied casually.
"Wow!"
Sam exclaimed.
"Cool,"
said Zack.
"By now he seemed a little perturbed," Archie continued, "but still not sufficiently agitated, I felt. So I emptied a bag of flour over his head."
"You emptied a bag of flour over Mr. Barnard's head?"
Dan gawked. "Indeed I did," Archie nodded, "just to let him know I was there, to get his attention."
"I bet you did that all right," laughed Sam. Archie raised one bushy eyebrow.
"It seemed to do the trick," he confirmed. "Then I delivered my message. It was the same one I had expressed in the classroom, but 1-to-1 its effect was considerably more powerful, particularly as I wrote it in the spilled flour."
Archie beamed at his young relatives.
"A nice touch, I thought," he added.
Archie had haunted Mr. Barnard all night long. He had pursued him around the house, tripped him up, and snatched things from his grasp. When the teacher had tried to hide in bed, Archie had tipped up the mattress and pulled the pillow out from beneath his head. And everywhere, in flour, in ink, even in the condensation on the windows, Archie had written his message. Dan, Zack, and Zoe must be allowed to play for Legs United on Saturday without penalty. Signed, Archibald Legg, the Phantom of the Cup. "It seems to have got through to him eventually," Archie concluded with a flourish of his walrus moustache.
"Archie, you're a genius," Dan declared exuberantly. "You really are."
"Laddie, laddie," Archie retorted nonchalantly, "tell me something I do not already know."
Chapter 10. Wrong-Footed. Number 15 Poplar Street was a happy, noisy house on Saturday morning.
There was a real buzz of excitement in anticipation of the weekend's cup games. Practicing on their recorders, the twins even managed to play the same melody at the same time, and almost in tune. It seemed to Sam and Dan like a good omen for what was to come. There was only one minor hiccup: the state of the meadow. The moles had been busy again during the night, and there were a number of bumps on the pitch. Sam and Dan discovered them when they went down for a kickabout after breakfast. "If Archie sees these molehills, he'll do his nut," Dan remarked with an anxious pull on his ear. "You're telling me," Sam agreed, flicking back her fringe. "We'll just have to make sure he doesn't see them," she stated decisively. "How are we going to do that?" Dan asked. "Like this," Sam cried, and she leapt with both feet onto one of the molehills. Then she leapt again. "We'll flatten them," she laughed, stamping. "I thought you liked moles," Dan teased. "Well, I do," Sam declared, "but I don't want to play on a pitch covered in bumps. Anyway, we're not actually hurting the moles." Dan followed his sister's lead, and soon Zack and the twins appeared and joined in as well. Flattening the molehills turned into a fun game. The 5 children leapt about the meadow like giant jet-powered frogs. It was tiring, too. After a while, they all collapsed in the middle of the pitch and lay on their backs in the late summer sunshine. "That was cool," Zack commented, and noisily the twins agreed. "Good fitness training, too," Dan observed breathlessly. "And we got rid of all the bumps," Sam said contentedly. Their efforts did not go unappreciated when Archie inspected the pitch later, just before the kick-off against Amberley Park. "There are a few blemishes, I see," he remarked with a slight twitch of his moustache, "but all in all, the surface seems to be in reasonable condition." He turned to his team with a serious expression. "I shall expect great football from you this afternoon," he said gravely. "Remember, this is the cup. A draw is no use. To progress, we must win. Let's make this a memorable weekend. A victory for Legs United in the cup today, a victory for Muddington Rovers tomorrow." He paused before continuing in a lighter tone. "As the great Herbert Chapman once said, all good things come in twos." The children laughed. "You made that up," Dan accused the phantom footballer. "Well, perhaps I did," Archie confessed, and his eyebrows hopped playfully. "Still, it's rather good, don't you think?" Dan and Sam looked at each other and groaned. Amberley Park were a strong team. They were high in the league like Legs United and had only lost once away from home. Watching them line up in their yellow and black striped shirts, Dan regretted all the training sessions his team had missed that week. He hoped they wouldn't be made to pay for their lack of preparation. In any case, he felt pretty sure he was in for another busy afternoon. In fact, during the first half, both defences were busy. The match was end-to-end, one side attacking and then the other. The main threat posed by Amberley came from their right winger, a tall, tricky player called Tom. A couple of times early in the game, he took on Justin and went past him on the outside. Fortunately for Legs United, his crosses were not very accurate and were easily cleared. As the half went on, however, the winger changed his line of attack to come inside Justin on the defender's right foot, which was his weaker one by a long way. The first time the Amberley winger adopted the tactic, he completely surprised Dan and his fellow defenders. Darting easily past Justin, Tom found himself in the Legs United area with a clear run on goal. He took full advantage. Sprinting forward, he slipped the ball past the advancing keeper, Gabby, into the bottom corner of the goal. Amberley Park were in the lead. But their lead didn't last long. In keeping with the game so far, Legs United went on the attack from the restart and forced a corner. Sam swung the ball in from the right with her left foot, Rollo Brown flicked the ball on at the near post, and Zoe headed it into the top of the net. She lost her glasses in the process, but she didn't care. She stood in the Amberley goalmouth grinning sort of woozily until Zack returned her glasses. Then she ran back to her own half with her arms in the air, whooping like a hyena. It was her first ever goal for Legs United. On the touchline, Anne and Stephen Legg, Mark and Nadia Legg, and Julia and Otis Brown applauded wildly and shouted encouragement. Beside them, Archie allowed himself a small, indulgent smile, while his outline shone like polished silver. It was Amberley Park and their winger Tom who had the last laugh, though, at least in the first half. Only minutes after Zack had hit the inside of the visitor's post, the ball was played out to the Amberley right. Tom took the ball in his stride and ran at Justin. He dummied to go outside the fullback, then cut inside again. Justin was completely wrong-footed, and once more Tom was through. This time, though, Dan had got himself in a better position to cover the winger's run. However, he too was fooled by the winger's trickery. A clever shimmy, and the Amberley player had another clear shooting chance. He arrowed the ball into the far corner of the net, with Gabby helpless. Amberley Park were ahead again, and Legs United were in trouble. Chapter 11. Twin Switch. Legs United were still 2-1 down when they came off at half-time. It had been an even game, though, and they weren't too disheartened. Nor, indeed, was Archie. He regarded his team thoughtfully. "For the most part," he contended, "your play has been admirable." He gazed down at the diagram of Arsenal's famous 10-second wonder goal that was painted on the grass next to the pitch. "At least," he added, "your attacking play has been good. Defensively, we have a problem." "That winger's brilliant," Dan declared. "He's not bad," Archie conceded. "He reminds me a little of Cliff Bastin, very cool in front of goal." Cliff Bastin was a fast goal-scoring winger in Herbert Chapman's Arsenal team. Archie had mentioned him many times, and always with the greatest admiration. "The thing is," Dan worried, "how are we going to stop him?" "Yes," Sam agreed sharply. "It's no good us scoring goals at their end if he keeps scoring in our goal. We've got to do something." She tossed back her head impetuously. Archie raised one large pale hand. "Patience, patience," he soothed. "Am I not Archibald Legg, master tactician?" "You mean you've got a solution?" Dan asked eagerly. "Naturally," Archie replied. "For the second half, I intend to make a slight adjustment. The twins, Jules and Dustin—" "Giles and Justin," chorused the twins as one. Quite so," Archie blustered. "Giles and Justin will switch sides. Giles on the left and Justin on the right." His announcement was met with blank looks and bewilderment. "Is that it?" Dan queried, bemused. "That's it," Archie beamed. "A masterstroke, don't you think?" The children glanced at one another and shrugged. What on earth was Archie up to? The brilliance of Archie's plan, however, soon became apparent. In Amberley's first attack of the second half, the ball was quickly fed out to Tom. Without hesitation, he ran at his opposing fullback, who was now the right-footed Giles, not the left-footed Justin. As in the first half, Tom feinted to go outside, then stepped inside. But this time, the winger was attacking the fullback's stronger side, and Giles easily took the ball off him. Minutes later, Tom got the ball again and attempted the same manoeuvre, a little quicker this time. But Giles made another strong tackle, winning the ball back for his team, who mounted an attack of their own. As Legs United went forward, Tom gazed at Giles with a puzzled expression. Dan could see what he was thinking. How could this fullback, who was so weak on his right foot in the first half, suddenly become so strong on that side now? Dan smiled. The winger obviously hadn't noticed that Legs United were playing identical twins at fullback. When in the visitors' next attack, Giles robbed Tom for a third time with a fine right-footed tackle, the Amberley player shook his head and frowned. He looked completely disheartened. The next time he received the ball, he didn't attempt to run. He just kicked it back into his own half. With Tom shackled, Amberley's attacking options were severely weakened. At the other end of the pitch, meanwhile, Legs United were rampant. On the wings, Francis and Ben, two of the Legg triplets, were causing havoc with their pace. The tiring Amberley fullbacks were no match for them. So it was no surprise when from one of Ben's runs, Zack hit the equalising goal. Now the second half became one-way traffic in the direction of the Amberley goal. Prompted by Sam's clever playmaking, Legs United created several chances. Zack hit a post. Rollo had a shot cleared off the line. Sam herself curled a free kick just over the bar. Finally, though, Amberley cracked. It was a move that would have brought a smile to Herbert Chapman's face, as Archie remarked later. Dan won the ball deep in defence. He slid it through to Sam in midfield. She swivelled and swept the ball out to the left flank, halfway inside the Amberley half. Francis sprinted after it and carried the ball forward to the penalty area before crossing to Zack. He controlled the ball and advanced in one movement, then flicked the ball inside to Ben, who raced on to fire an unstoppable drive past the Amberley keeper. Legs United were in the lead. The Legs spectators cheered and hugged one another. This time, even Archie showed his delight. He waved his arms in the air and did a little jig of joy, his knobbly knees pumping comically. Watching him, the twins collapsed in a fit of laughter. For the rest of the game, Amberley were a beaten side. Their heads went down, and they were no match for their exuberant opponents. Zack dribbled past 3 defenders to score his second goal, and Sam completed the rout with a fine run and shot from the edge of the Amberley penalty box. When the final whistle went, Legs United had won by 5 goals to 2. Their first ever cup match had ended in a great victory. Now it was over to Muddington Rovers. Chapter 12. The Big Match. The atmosphere inside the ground was electric. At each end, rival supporters sang their chants lustily. There was a real sense of expectation amongst the Muddington Rovers crowd that today their team could pull off an amazing giant-killing feat and knock out the mighty Tottenham Hotspur. In their special seats in the central stand, the Muddington primary football team chattered excitedly, discussing their recent meeting with the Muddington Rovers players. Dan gazed down in awe at his programme and the autographs he had collected. All the Muddington Rovers players had signed their names, and so too had the Tottenham Hotspur stars. Beside Dan, Archie hovered restlessly in the aisle, looking around with interest and impatience, while in the seat on Dan's other side, Zack sat staring at the pitch as if he were in a dream. It had all been so amazing. One member of the party seemed particularly overawed by the occasion. It wasn't a child, it was Mr. Barnard. He was very quiet all afternoon and appeared to be uncharacteristically nervous. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if he feared someone was following him. And with some justification, for every now and then Archie did indeed take up a position behind the teacher, looming over him like an avenging angel. Once the phantom footballer even proposed pouring a cup of cold tea over the teacher's head, but Dan dissuaded him. "I think you've haunted him enough, Archie," he said firmly. "He's got the message." "Oh, very well," Archie muttered disappointedly. "I must say I was rather enjoying being a troublesome spook." "Well, now you can be a spooktator instead," Zack joked. As they waited for the teams to appear, Archie entertained his young relatives with talk of famous cup upsets of the past, the greatest of which involved Herbert Chapman's Arsenal. "It was just a year before he died, 1933, Archie stated solemnly. "The press called Arsenal the Bank of England because of all their expensive players, while Walsall, their opponents, were worth just £69. Several influential Arsenal players were unable to play, however, having been laid low with influenza." Archie sighed deeply. "Sadly, their replacements were not up to the mark," he lamented. "Walsall won by 2-0. Archie's expression was so tragic that Dan felt quite sorry for him. "Oh well," he cajoled, "if the great Arsenal can be beaten like that, then there's hope for Muddington Rovers, isn't there?" This suggestion appeared to revive Archie's spirits. "You have a point," he conceded, with a small twitch of his big moustache. As it happened, however, the game began badly for Muddington Rovers. Tottenham Hotspur took the lead with their first attack of the game, and by half-time they were 3 goals ahead. During the interval, Archie decided to join Stephen Legg, Sam and the twins, who were watching the match from behind one of the goals. "It's good to get an all-round view of the game," he declared coolly before floating away through the air. "I bet Sam's in a right strop," Dan remarked, watching Archie go. "Tommy Banks has hardly had a kick." "Except that one the Tottenham sweeper gave him," observed Zack ruefully. Dan tugged at his ear anxiously. "He'd better not get injured," he said. "It would ruin our surprise." His worries, however, were unfounded. The second half was far more evenly balanced than the first, and Tommy Banks played as well as anyone. In fact, to the home crowd's delight, he scored the only goal of the half. With just minutes remaining, he jinked past 2 Tottenham defenders and thumped the ball into the net. It may only have been a consolation goal, but the Muddington supporters celebrated as if it were the winner. At the end of the match, the Muddington Rovers team were given a standing ovation by their fans, Dan, Zach and Zoe among them. The applause continued until the last player had left the pitch. And then, as the spectators started to leave, came the tannoy's announcement. Chapter 13. A Special Surprise.
Will Sam Legg please see the steward at entrance P? He has an important message for her.
The announcement resounded around the emptying stadium. Sam sat bolt upright in her seat with a look of astonishment on her freckly, now pink face. Beside her, hovering in the aisle, Archie raised one bushy eyebrow.
"That's you, Sam!"
cried the twins as one. "It is," Stephen Legg agreed. He looked at his daughter with a wry smile. "Unless there's someone else in this ground with exactly the same name," he teased, "which I doubt very much."
"But what can it be about?"
Sam wondered. She peered across at the special area of the central stand where Dan, Zach, Zoe and the rest of the Muddington primary school team had been seated, but the seats were empty. "Don't you think you ought to go and find out?" Stephen Legg prompted.
"Go on, Sam!"
Justin shouted.
"Hurry up!"
Giles urged.
"An excellent idea,"
Archie agreed. He wrinkled his moustache theatrically.
"I shall accompany you."
Entrance P was just above them, and as most of the spectators in their block had departed by now, it took Archie and an excited Sam only moments to get there.
"Sam Legg?"
inquired a burly man in a luminous yellow steward's jacket. Sam nodded.
"Yes,"
she said breathlessly.
"I'm to take you to your brother," the steward informed her. "He needs to speak to you about something."
"What is it?" Sam asked, puzzled.
"I don't know, love," the steward shrugged. "I'm just the messenger."
Sam turned to her ghostly relative.
"Come on, Archie," she urged.
"Eh?" said the steward in obvious confusion.
"Oh, nothing," said Sam quickly, blushing. "I was just talking to my invisible friend."
"Ah," said the steward with an understanding smile. "I used to have one of them. Bobo, I called him."
"Bobo,"
Archie repeated disdainfully as he followed Sam and the steward out of the stand. They walked along several corridors and down a number of staircases before stopping at last by a door that said, "Private, Hospitality Suite."
"Well, here we are,"
the steward said genially. Sam's heart was racing as the steward opened the door. But it almost galloped away completely when she saw who was in the room beyond, looking straight at her as she walked through the doorway. It was Tommy Banks. Next to him, with a huge grin on his round face, was Dan.
"Surprise, surprise," he grinned. "Ah, this must be my #1 fan,"
Tommy Banks greeted Sam.
"Put it there."
He reached out a hand to shake.
"It's a pleasure to meet you,"
he said warmly. For once, Sam was quite lost for words. She just nodded her head with a shy smile and shook her hero's hand.
"Your brother tells me you wanted my autograph, so I've signed this for you," said Tommy Banks.
He handed Sam a programme of that day's match against Tottenham. Across the front he'd written, "To Sam, best wishes. Thanks for your support." Then he'd signed his name underneath.
"Thanks,"
Sam muttered, quite overcome. Tommy Banks winked.
"It's the least I could do," he remarked. "Sorry we couldn't manage a win for you."
"That's okay," Sam uttered timidly.
"Well, you can't win them all, can you?"
Tommy Banks continued heartily.
"Unless you're Man United, of course."
He grinned broadly.
"Well, I'd better get back to the bath," he laughed, "before the lads take all the hot water."
He put his hand on Sam's shoulder for a second, then winked again.
"See you. Keep cheering," he said.
Then, with a quick wave of his hand, he strode away. Sam watched her hero go, then turned and threw her arms round Dan's neck.
"You're a star," she cried happily.
"It was Tommy Banks's idea," Dan said modestly. "When I told him how much you adore him, he said he just had to meet you." Sam snorted.
"He seems a nice enough young fellow,"
Archie remarked amiably, though I still say he could do with losing a few pounds. Now, in my day—
Oh, Archie, be quiet, Dan said good-humouredly. Can't you see Sam's in love?
Sam aimed a playful punch at her brother. Said Archie, his eyebrows hopping like frisky caterpillars. It takes all sorts, I suppose. He stroked his moustache thoughtfully. Well, Muddington Rovers may have lost a game, but they've certainly won a heart. He nodded at the still beaming Sam, and in that joyful moment, the phantom manager shone like the FA Cup itself. Spot the Ball. Chapter 1. Ask Archie.
It's there, Sam Legg exclaimed. It's got to be there.
She was leaning over the competition page in her brother Dan's football magazine, pointing to an area in the picture where she thought the invisible ball should be. The competition was called Spot the Ball and showed two players jumping in the air. The ball had been removed from the picture, and you had to guess where you thought it should be.
No, you're wrong, said Dan, shaking his head. The ball's over here.
He pointed to a spot at the other side of the picture. Sam Legg tossed back her fringe dismissively.
Don't be stupid,
she snorted.
They'd have to have their heads on back to front for the ball to end up there.
Dan eyed his sister coolly.
Since when were you such an expert on heading the ball? He demanded.
Then, with a sniff, he added,
Your heading's about as good as your tackling.
Sam Legg made no secret of the fact that she found tackling boring. She liked passing, dribbling and shooting, and hardly ever tackled at all. She was the midfield playmaker of Legs United, the family football team that she and Dan played in. Dan was the team's central defender and captain. He was a strong tackler, and having the advantage of being tall and well-built, was good in the air too. Though only a year younger than her brother, Sam was a good foot shorter, and not noted for her heading ability.
You don't have to be brilliant in the air to know that the ball can't be where you say it is,
Sam retorted tartly, ignoring her brother's jibe about her tackling.
You won't win this competition and get those cool yellow boots if you put your cross there.
A dreamy look came into her eyes.
I want a pair of red boots, like Tommy Banks wears, she sighed.
Tommy Banks was the star of the local league club, Muddington Rovers, and was Sam's favourite player. She had pictures of him all over her bedroom wall.
Well, I won't win with your suggestion,
Dan insisted. He frowned thoughtfully for a moment or two.
I've got an idea, he said suddenly. Why don't we ask Archie what he thinks?
Archie, alias Archibald Legg, was the children's great-great-uncle and the manager of Legs United. He was also a ghost. Sam's green eyes narrowed as she considered her brother's suggestion. Then she nodded.
OK,
she agreed.
But I bet I'm right.
They went over to a glass cabinet that stood against a wall near the door. Inside was an ancient brown leather football, flanked by an equally aged pair of bulky shin guards. On top of the cabinet was an old black-and-white photo of Archie himself, dressed in football kit. Sam opened the cabinet and took out the football. For over 60 years, since he had been struck down by lightning during a match, Archie had inhabited the old ball. For most of that time, the ball had lain flat and forgotten in the Legs loft, with Archie trapped inside. It was only recently that the ball had been discovered and Archie released. Rubbing the ball gently, Sam spoke the words that had magically brought forth her phantom relative like the genie from Aladdin's lamp on that first occasion, and on many others since.
"Arise, oh Archie!" she wailed. "Archie, arise!"
There was a fizz and a flash like a firework rocket igniting, and out of the ball flared Archibald Legg. He was dressed, as ever, in the full kit, though a very old-fashioned one, of Muddington Rovers, for whom he had played during his lifetime. He wore a black and green striped shirt, long, baggy white shorts, and green woolly socks that concealed thick shin pads. On his feet were clumpy leather football boots with gleaming steel toe caps. At his throat, worn cowboy style, was a red neckerchief, whose brightness contrasted with the ghostly pallor of his skin. Most impressive of all, though, was his facial hair. An enormous walrus moustache, vivid bushy caterpillar eyebrows, and a flaming red mane that stood up on his head as if he was permanently in the grip of an electric shock. Around him, a ghostly aura glowed.
"Right, gather round," he commanded grandly, his eyes looking up towards the ceiling. "It is time I commenced my pre-match address."
He waggled his huge moustache imperiously and prepared to continue. A loud cough from Sam stopped him. He looked down at her with a deep frown that drew his eyebrows into a hairy V.
"Yes?" he inquired testily. "What's the matter, laddie?"
Dan grinned at his ghostly ancestor.
"It's not match time yet, Archie," he said with a chuckle. "We're still at home."
Archie looked about the room with a confused air.
"Then why have you summoned me?" he demanded at last.
"We need your help," Sam said, with a wrinkle of her small, freckly nose.
"Yes, your expert opinion,"
Dan added flatteringly, and with immediate effect. Archie's frown changed at once to a beaming smile. He positively shone.
"Ah, yes, of course," he murmured warmly. "I'm always happy to impart my considerable expertise. What is it? A tricky tactical problem? A question of strategy? A move requiring that little touch of brilliance that only I can supply?"
Dan and Sam looked at one another and rolled their eyes.
"It's nothing like that," Dan muttered.
"No, it's this," said Sam, thrusting the magazine page in front of Archie's startled gaze. "We want you to tell us where in the picture you think the missing ball should be. I think it should be here." She pointed at her chosen spot. "And Dan," she laughed in ridicule, "well, he thinks it should be there." She spoke as if her brother's suggestion was the most absurd she had ever heard in her life. Archie took hold of the magazine and stared at it quizzically for some seconds. Then he regarded his young relatives with cool disdain.
"You are both quite wrong," he announced. "The ball is obviously here."
He indicated a spot on the ground almost directly underneath the leaping players.
"How can that be?"
Dan queried, pulling at one ear with a perplexed expression.
"Yes, how can you be so sure?" Sam asked suspiciously. "Ah," sighed Archie smugly, "call it ghost's intuition."
He tapped one bony finger on his long nose, and his smile grew even more radiant.
"Or I suppose you could always call it genius."
Chapter 2. Mixed Fruit. A couple of hours later, the Legs United players were in Drayton Park, standing in a tight group as Archie began the team talk he'd been about to give in the sitting room earlier. At the other end of the pitch, their opponents, St. Luke's Boys Club, were gathered in their own little huddle.
"Now, lads," said Archie with an indulgent wiggle of his moustache, "this match today is the first of 2 successive away fixtures. St. Luke's today and,
He hesitated for a moment, frowning vaguely.
Some other team next week," he concluded fuzzily. "These matches, I am sure, will be the biggest test of your progress so far. Any reasonable side should win their home games. It is getting results away that distinguishes a really good team."
Archie paused to study his players for an instant before continuing.
"When Arsenal first won the championship under Herbert Chapman in 1931, they collected half of their points away from home, scoring a record 60 goals.
These words were accompanied by the expression of deep reverence that always appeared on Archie's face when he mentioned the great Arsenal manager and his team.
"Of course," he added, "their fast counter-attacking style was perfectly suited to playing away. They soaked up pressure and then suddenly broke free like rampaging lions. Desperate defence became deadly attack in seconds. That is how I expect you to play this afternoon. And next week, too. Banana, raspberry, satsuma, prickly pear, kumquat."
The children stared at Archie in astonishment. Dan and Sam's younger brothers, the twins, Giles and Justin, fell against each other laughing.
"Prickly pear?" cried Giles. "Kumquat!" giggled Justin.
"Archie, what are you talking about?" Dan quizzed his phantom relative.
Archie seemed momentarily as bemused as his team.
"How curious," he said at last. I suddenly heard this spirit voice in the air listing fruit. There must be a greengrocer haunting nearby."
Sam shivered. "Not too near, I hope," she said, glancing warily about her as if trying to spot the phantom.
"Yeah, supposing St. Luke's have got a ghost too," said Zack.
But Archie wagged his head.
"Huh," he snorted. "I don't think the ghost of a greengrocer is worth worrying about. It would hardly be a match for the great Archibald Legg." "Except at taking banana shots," quipped Dan. "And making grape saves," joked Zack.
Archie glowered at his young relatives, but before he could make any retort, the referee blew his whistle for the teams to get ready for the kick-off. Legs United lined up in their normal WM formation, a system invented by Herbert Chapman. In goal was Gabby. Then came Giles, Dan and Justin in defence. Then Rollo and Jack. Then Zoe and Sam in front of them. Then Ben, Zack and Francis in attack. Archie took up his customary match position near the halfway line, standing with his hands on his hips and with one foot on the old ball. Further along the touchline was a small group of Legs United supporters. Stephen Legg, his brother Mark, and their sister Julia Brown. The Legs United team was made up from the children of these three siblings.
"Come on, you Legs!"
Stephen Legg shouted as the referee blew his whistle for the game to begin. It was, as Archie had predicted, a stern test for Legs United. St. Luke's Boys Club were a strong team with some skillful players. They were very sporting too, unlike some of the sides Legs United had met in the league, and the game was played in a competitive but friendly spirit. At half-time, the score was 0-0. Sam had been closest to scoring with a shot from the edge of the penalty area that shaved the bar.
"That was a great shot,"
the St. Luke's captain applauded Sam when the two sides walked off at the interval.
"You deserve to score."
"Thanks," Sam replied with a freckly smile. "I'll aim a little lower next time." Archie was happy enough with his team's first-half performance. They just needed to add a little more pace to their counter-attacks, he said. And he drew their attention, as he often had, to Arsenal's famous 10-second wonder goal, a diagram of which was whitewashed on the grass beside their home pitch, the Meadow.
"Strike quickly, that's the secret," he proclaimed.
5 minutes into the second half, Legs United had the perfect opportunity to follow their manager's instruction. They'd been under heavy pressure for the whole of those 5 minutes, and St. Luke's had forced a couple of corners in succession. From the second one, the ball broke to Sam, who was standing just outside her own penalty area. Finding herself in space, she sprinted forward to the halfway line, then slid the ball beyond the last St. Luke's defender and into the path of Zack. In a couple of strides, he was inside the St. Luke's penalty box, and as the goalie came out, he calmly slotted the ball into the bottom left-hand corner of the net.
"Great goal, Zack!"
Dan congratulated his cousin and best friend as he ran back to the centre circle. He grinned.
"It was a real peach, in fact," he said.
Archie certainly looked well satisfied with his team's efforts. He waggled his moustache flamboyantly and glowed like an electric fire. However, the glow faded to a flicker when a little later a mix-up in the Legs' defence let in the St. Luke's skipper to score the equaliser. As the ball trickled over the line, Archie put one transparently pale hand over his eyes and sighed. The match continued to be hard-fought, with both teams having dangerous attacks. Rollo Brown, Zack's older brother, had a header cleared off the line, and Zack himself went close too. At the Legs' end, Zack's younger sister Gabby was in spectacular form. As well as being a goalie, she was an excellent gymnast, and it showed in her keeping. She wasn't very big, but she had a terrific leap. Twice she soared like a swallow to tip goal-bound efforts over the bar.
"That was brilliant,"
said the St. Luke's captain admiringly the second time.
"I was sure that shot was going in."
Gabby just smiled shyly as she got to her feet. Dan played his part too. He tackled superbly, and as the game neared its end, kept encouraging his tiring teammates. With 5 minutes left, Legs United were awarded a free kick on the left-hand side of the St. Luke's penalty area. Dan sprinted upfield to join the attack.
"Cross it in, Sam,"
he urged as he passed his sister to take up his position near the opponent's goal. Sam stood over the ball, surveying the crowded penalty box. She tossed back her fringe, then trotted towards the ball purposefully, eyes gazing forward. At the last moment, though, instead of crossing the ball, she flicked it sideways towards her cousin, Ben Brown. For an instant, the players in the penalty area were completely dumbfounded. They stood staring out at Sam as if searching for the ball. In that instant, Ben had sprinted forward to the byline. Glancing up, he whipped a low cross into the 6-yard box, straight to the feet of his cousin Zach. A second later, the ball was nestling in the St. Luke's net.
Goal!
The 3 Legs United parents jumped up and down in excited celebration. Beside them, Archie's glow returned. There was nothing he liked better than a piece of quick thinking, especially when it resulted in a goal for his side. "Lemons," he murmured, repeating the ghostly whisper he'd just heard in the air. He shook his head and sighed.
"Greengrocers," he said to himself. "They have no appreciation of great football."
Chapter 3. Nuts. Zach's goal proved to be the winner. A few minutes later, the referee blew his whistle for the end of the match.
"3 cheers for Legs United!" cried the St. Luke's skipper. "Hip hip, hooray!"
His team responded 3 times.
"3 cheers for St. Luke's!"
Dan replied, returning the home team's gesture. The players shook hands as they walked from the field. Archie greeted his team with a huge, hairy smile.
"An excellent contest," he purred. "Played in the true spirit of the game."
His moustache twitched contentedly.
"You think Herbert Chapman would have approved then?"
Dan remarked, a big smile on his round face.
"Undoubtedly so,"
Archie agreed happily. He turned to Sam Legg.
"And that free kick was worthy of the wee wizard Alex James himself,"
he declared, with an appreciative wag of his large head.
"It reminded me of the goal he scored to win the 1930 Cup final against Huddersfield Town."
Sam grinned. She knew this was praise indeed, for the Arsenal playmaker, Alex James, was Archie's favourite player.
"Not bad for a girl, eh?"
she observed teasingly. Archie fixed Sam with a steely gaze.
"You're all lads to me," he retorted.
He looked around his players proudly.
"My lads, my team, my coconuts."
His eyebrows hopped like startled caterpillars.
"Coconuts?"
he repeated questioningly.
"It must be that ghostly greengrocer again," laughed Dan.
Archie muttered disapprovingly.
"Well, I wish he would keep his talk of fruit to himself. This is a playing field, not a shop."
He glanced about him with a stern expression. Then his face relaxed once more.
"Anyway, that was a fine performance," he said warmly, "although there are 1 or 2 things I should like to put straight before the next match." "That win puts us above the Colts in the table now,"
said Zach Brown, who loved football statistics of all kinds.
"Yes!"
Dan shouted joyfully, punching the air. The Muddington Colts were the team that Perry Nolan, Dan's arch-enemy, played for. They were also the next team due to visit Legs United's home ground, the Meadow, in 2 weeks' time. The sides had met once before in a summer tournament when Legs United had won narrowly.
"We're going to thrash them at our place,"
Dan crowed, and he jigged with delight. Archie yawned, and his outline started to glimmer weakly, like a torch with a fading battery.
"All this excitement has made me quite weary," he said woozily. "I think it's time I retired to my pig's bladder for a rest. Please do not disturb me until the morning."
So saying, he began to disappear from the children's sight. Within seconds, he had dematerialized into the old ball, the inner part of which was indeed made of a pig's bladder. The twins came running over.
"Hey, Dad says he'll buy us all an ice lolly if we hurry up and get changed," cried Giles. "Yeah, we can have any flavour we like," Justin whooped. "Orange, banana, strawberry."
"Sounds like Dad's heard that ghostly greengrocer too," Dan said happily to Sam and Zach. He looked up into the sky with his arms held aloft.
"Goodbye, Mr. Greengrocer, whoever you are,"
he proclaimed dramatically.
"You're crazy,"
said Sam, wrinkling her nose.
"Nuts,"
added Zach laughingly. Dan lowered his arms and picked up the old ball.
"Come on, let's go and get changed," he said. "I want my strawberry sparkle."
He ran off towards the changing pavilion, closely followed by the rest of the team. Chapter 4. Lost Ball. On Sunday morning, Dan was lying in bed, happily reliving some of his best moments from the previous afternoon's game, when the door to his room suddenly flew open and Sam burst in. Her freckly face was pink with emotion. "Dan!" she cried breathlessly. "What have you done with the ball?" "Eh? What ball?" Dan questioned sleepily.
"Archie's ball, of course," Sam hissed sharply. "It's not in the cabinet. Where did you put it?"
Dan frowned. "What do you mean, where did I put it?"
"I didn't put it anywhere,"
he replied, bemused.
"I thought you had it,"
he added tentatively, tugging on one ear.
"Of course I don't," Sam snorted fiercely. "I wouldn't be asking you if I did, would I?"
Dan shrugged.
"Dad must have it then,"
he said coolly, but he felt a small ripple of unease.
"I'll go and ask him,"
said Sam, rushing out again. Dan quickly leapt out of bed and followed his sister. Stephen Legg was in the kitchen, eating toast and reading his newspaper. He looked up in mild amusement as Sam and Dan rushed in.
"There's no hurry," he remarked amiably. "The breakfast bar's still open."
He brushed a few crumbs from his beard.
"Dad, where's Archie's ball?" Sam demanded. "It's not in the cabinet."
Stephen Legg pulled an extravagant search me face.
"I've no idea," he said. "Have you asked your mother?"
But Anne Legg hadn't seen the ball. Neither had the twins, Giles and Justin. Subsequent inquiries to the Legg family next door and the Browns down the street also drew a blank. Nobody, it seemed, knew where the old ball was. Dan peered at the glass cabinet in the sitting room where the ball was usually kept. The old leather shin guards were there, but there was a space where the ball should have been. Who had had the ball last, he wondered. He'd carried it to the changing room. He remembered that. Then they'd all gone off to have an ice cream.
"Sam! Sam!"
he shouted, his face flushed with panic.
"What is it?"
Sam asked anxiously.
"I think the ball's still in the changing room," Dan cried. "Let's get Dad. We've got to go and get it back."
15 minutes later, Stephen Legg drove into Drayton Park, the home ground of St. Luke's Boys' Club, with two highly agitated young passengers, Dan and Sam. Also in the car was Zach Brown, who very rarely got worked up about anything, but even he was looking concerned. Without the ball, they couldn't summon their phantom manager. If the ball was lost, so was Archie. The moment the car drew to a halt, the children had their doors open and were racing towards the pavilion. Once inside, they rushed to the changing room they'd occupied the day before. Their spirits sank as they looked around the empty room. They searched under the benches, but there was nothing there.
"It's gone,"
said Dan glumly. He sat down on one of the benches with his head in his hands.
"Maybe someone handed it in,"
Zach suggested brightly.
"Or maybe the janitor found it." "Yeah, let's ask at the office," said Sam decisively.
They knocked on a door marked Park Superintendent. A plump, elderly man wearing glasses and a green uniform answered.
"Yes,"
he wheezed.
"We lost the ball,"
Sam gabbled.
"What's that?"
queried the man, frowning.
"Lost, Abel? Who's that? Your dog? Your brother?"
Sam shook her head vigorously.
"No, not our dog. We've lost our ball," she said emphatically. "It's a special ball," Dan added. "It's very old and it's—"
He was about to say the ball was magic, which was true, of course, but he suddenly thought it would sound stupid to say so.
"It's very heavy," he continued, "and made of worn brown leather." "Sounds like you could do with a new one," the man suggested.
He prodded his glasses higher on his nose.
"I've got a couple in lost property that no one's claimed." "We don't want a new ball," Dan exclaimed. "We want our old one back." "We left it here Saturday afternoon," Zach explained.
"Could you have a look in lost property for us?" Sam pleaded. The park superintendent coughed and patted his chest.
"Well, yes, I suppose so," he said genially.
He disappeared inside his office for a moment and then reappeared with a huge bunch of keys.
"Follow me, lads,"
he instructed. He led Dan, Sam and Zach along the corridor to a door with the words Lost Property painted on it and a heavy padlock on its handle.
"Now,"
he said, peering through his glasses at the mass of keys,
Which of these is the right one, I wonder?
Waiting for the park superintendent to locate the padlock key was agony for the children. Especially Dan, who tugged anxiously at one ear, then the other, and finally both at once.
Ah, here we are,
said the superintendent at last. He put the key in the padlock, and the bolt clicked free. Then he pulled the door open.
See if you can find your ball in there,
he urged, standing aside. Eagerly, the children rushed into the room, rummaging through a motley assortment of muddy socks, boots, jerseys, gloves, scarves, shin pads, tennis balls. They found a bicycle pump, a notebook, a dictionary, 2 flat footballs, but not their ball. Not Archie's ball.
It isn't here,
said Dan disconsolately. No, Sam agreed, equally distressed.
Is there anywhere else it could be?
Zack asked in desperation.
Well,
sighed the superintendent,
the janitor's the man to ask. He may have put your ball somewhere, I suppose.
As one, the 3 children gazed up at him with revived expectation. Where can we find him? Dan asked excitedly, infused with new hope. But the superintendent's frown was not encouraging.
That's the problem, you see,
he said with an apologetic shake of his head.
Right now he's on a plane to Ibiza.
Then, taking in the children's dumb bewilderment, he explained,
He's gone to Spain for his holidays. He left this morning.
When will he be back? Dan inquired weakly, hope suddenly sliding down into his shoes. The superintendent looked bleak.
Not for a fortnight, I'm afraid, he said grimly.
Chapter 5. Missing Archie. Dan was inconsolable. It was all his fault the ball was lost. He was the one who'd left it in the changing room. And all because he'd been too busy thinking about ice cream. Now poor Archie was doomed to spend the rest of his ghostly existence, or at the very least the next 2 weeks, trapped inside the old ball. I'm sure it'll turn up. Anne Legg tried to reassure her oldest son, but without success. Stephen Legg contacted the St. Luke's Boys' Club to see if they had the ball or knew where it might be, but they didn't. They said they'd look out for it next time they played. The park superintendent was very helpful too. He put up a notice about the missing ball in the Drayton Park Pavilion. But it seemed to Dan and the rest of the Leggs family that the best, perhaps only hope of finding the ball lay with the absent janitor. How on earth would they be able to bear the next fortnight? An atmosphere of profound gloom descended on the homes of the Leggs and Browns over the next days. They had grown very fond of their ghostly relative and his funny ways since the day Sam and Dan had first summoned him from the old ball. Already they missed his stories about Herbert Chapman and Arsenal. They missed his colourful training sessions and his extraordinary ball skills. They even missed his boasts about what a genius he was. If only Archie would turn up, he could claim he was the greatest manager in the entire universe ever, and I wouldn't care, sighed Sam sadly the next afternoon, when she and Dan and Zack were in the meadow doing some half-hearted practice. Nor would I, Dan agreed. Archie did like to blow his own trumpet, it was true, but he was amazing. His tactics were brilliant. They may sometimes have appeared bizarre, but they always proved successful in the end. He was the one who'd formed the team in the first place. How could it go on without him, Dan wondered. Do you think we should cancel Saturday's match against Limpton Park? He said to the others. I don't know, Sam said, wrinkling her small nose. I don't feel much like playing. No, Zack concurred. He peered out glumly from behind a line of drooping black ringlets. It won't be the same without Archie. The 3 sat in melancholy silence for a minute or so. Then Zack said, But I think Archie would want us to play. Remember what he said on Saturday about good teams being the ones that did well away from home? He thought this game was really important. Yes, you're right, Dan agreed. He saw a picture in his head of Archie shimmering and flickering before them, outraged at the idea that they might not play. Sam had a similar vision. Yeah, he'd want us to play all right, she nodded. I guess we ought to carry on then, said Dan, though he didn't sound very enthusiastic. At that moment a horn honked at the other side of the meadow. Looking up, Dan groaned. Perry Nolan was there on his bike, leaning on the fence and looking smugger than ever. "I hear you lost your lucky ball. Shame," he jeered. "How do you know about our ball?" Dan snapped. Perry shrugged. "I saw the notice, didn't I?" he said. "Down at the park." "Yeah, well, we don't need your sympathy," Dan added roughly, "so you can clear off." Perry laughed unpleasantly. "Well, you'd better find that lucky ball before you play us next week," he said, "because you're going to need all the luck you can get." "You're the ones who'll need luck," said Sam, tossing her head defiantly. "We'll murder you." "Yeah," Dan said. Then he smiled slyly. "Have you looked at the league table recently?" he inquired with pretend innocence. Perry scowled. "You've just been lucky so far," he snorted. "Wait till you play some decent opposition. We're going to take you apart." "What, like you did at your place?" Sam laughed, and Zack and Dan joined in. 4-3, 4-3, they chanted. That was the score Legs United had won by when they'd played the Colts in the summer. "You can laugh now," Perry sniped, "but you won't be laughing next week. We want revenge, and we're going to get it, whether you've got your stupid ball or not." With this heated prediction, he hooted his horn loudly and rode away. Chapter 6. Spot the Problem. If losing Archie wasn't catastrophe enough, the following morning brought a new disaster: chicken pox. It wasn't Dan himself who was infected. All of his family had had the illness. So had their cousins next door. But Zack hadn't. Rollo Brown, Zack's older brother, who had had chickenpox as a baby, broke the news on his way to school. "Zack's got chickenpox," he announced in his usual understated way. "He's covered in spots." "Oh no, poor Zack," said Dan sympathetically. Then a thought occurred to him. "He'll be okay for Saturday, won't he?" he inquired. "Of course he won't," Anne Legg exclaimed. "He can't go anywhere till those spots go." "How long will that take?" Dan asked with an anxious pull of his ear. "A week or two, I think," his mother informed him. "Your dad's the one to ask." Stephen Legg was a doctor. Dan quickly went off to seek his professional opinion. He confirmed the worst. It would indeed be about a fortnight before Zack would be able to play for Legs United in a match again. "I suppose Billy will have to play against Limpton Park," Dan said. Billy was Zoe and the triplets' younger brother. "Well, Billy's a good player," said Stephen Legg encouragingly. "And he's been to most of Archie's training sessions, hasn't he?" "Yes," Dan agreed gloomily. "Well then," Stephen Legg continued heartily, "cometh the hour, cometh the man, as they say. I'm sure Billy will do just fine." Dan muttered without conviction. Billy was a good player for his age, but losing Zack was a big blow. He was Legs United's top goalscorer, and his goals, like the two against St Luke's the previous Saturday, had regularly won or saved games for the team. They couldn't expect Billy to do that. He'd never played a proper football match in his life. Dan went round to see his sick cousin when he got home from school that afternoon. Zack was tucked up on the sofa in the Browns' living room, watching a video of his favourite programme, The X-Files. As Rollo had said, Zack was very spotty, and his face was a bit swollen. He looked a bit like something out of The X-Files himself, Dan thought, but he didn't say it. He said how sorry he was that Zack was ill. Then he talked with his friend about the team situation. "I guess you could play Rollo up front," Zack suggested. Rollo was the oldest and tallest of the cousins, and once or twice in the past Archie had played him as a striker. "Yeah, I suppose so," Dan agreed. "He's not as good as you, though." "He's good in the air," said Zack, trying to be positive. Dan muttered uncertainly. He pulled at his ear. "You've got to play in the Colts match, though," he declared desperately, "even if you have to wear a mask or something." Zack smiled. "I'll be okay by then," he said confidently. Dan looked at his friend questioningly. "Do those spots hurt?" he asked. He'd been really young when he'd had chickenpox, and he couldn't remember anything about it. "Not really," Zack shrugged. "They're just itchy, that's all. Mum puts this white cream on my skin to stop them itching so much, but I still want to scratch them." Dan nodded.
The two sat in thoughtful silence for a moment or two. Then Dan said, "I wonder why it's called chicken pox. I mean, you don't look like a chicken, do you? More like a Dalmatian."
"Yeah," said Zack, with a wistful glance at his spotty arm.
At that instant, something green and slimy squelched across the TV screen.
"I didn't know Perry Nolan was on the X-Files," Dan joked grimly, and Zack laughed.
His laughter quickly died, though, when the door opened and Gabby came into the room. Dan stared at her, horrified.
"Oh, no!" he cried. "Not you as well!"
Gabby wasn't as spotty as her brother, but she bore the telltale marks of chickenpox. Her skin was lighter than Zack's, and her spots were more prominent. They stood out on her face like bumpy red ink blots.
"They've just appeared," said Gabby. "Max has got them too."
Max was Zack and Gabby's little brother.
"This is a disaster," groaned Dan. "What are we going to do now? We won't have a full team on Saturday. We'll have to play with 10 men. "But who'll play in goal?" Gabby asked anxiously.
Dan sighed helplessly.
"I don't know,"
he said. He put his head in his hands.
"Everything's going wrong," he moaned, shaking his head miserably. "If only Archie were here."
Chapter 7. The Gobbler Strikes. That night, Dan had a strange dream about Archie. He dreamt that his phantom relative had been abducted by spotty green aliens to coach their football team. They would only return him, they said, if Legs United played a match against them and beat them. But the aliens would be sure to win if Archie was coaching them, Dan thought. How could Legs United triumph? Things went from bad to worse. When the aliens lined up, there were hundreds of them, and when Dan looked around, he saw that the rest of his team had disappeared. He was all alone. And there on the touchline was Archie, standing as usual with his hands on his hips. But the old ball had turned into a coconut. Archie's hair, eyebrows and moustache had gone green, and his face was all spotty.
"Oh, no,"
Dan groaned as he realized that Archie had become an alien. Now they'd never get him back. Archie was lost forever. Dan woke up soaked in sweat. He'd had scarier nightmares before, but none that left him feeling so awful. He told Sam about the dream at breakfast, but her response wasn't very sympathetic.
"You should feel bad," she said bluntly with a toss of her head. "It's your fault that Archie's lost." "But I didn't do it on purpose," Dan protested.
"It doesn't make any difference, does it?" Sam persisted. But then, seeing the hurt look on her brother's face, she softened a little and added, "We'll just have to do our best until Archie turns up again, won't we? Even if we have only got 10 players.
"Yeah,"
Dan agreed. He tried to sound positive, but it wasn't easy when he still had a ghastly picture of a green-haired, spotty Archie in his head.
"I think we ought to have a team meeting," Sam continued. "We need to get things sorted for Saturday, like who's going to play in goal."
Dan nodded.
"Yeah, you're right," he said with an air of resignation. "Let's get everyone round tonight."
It was a long day. Dan found it difficult to concentrate at school with everything that was on his mind. Several times he was told off for daydreaming.
"Is there something bothering you, Daniel?"
asked his teacher, Mrs. Williams, at the end of the afternoon.
No, I'm just a bit tired," Dan replied, faking a yawn. "Well, I hope you'll be a bit more awake tomorrow," said his teacher. "You look like you're on another planet today."
"Yes, sorry, Mrs. Williams," Dan apologized. His teacher didn't know how right she was, he thought. That evening, at the team meeting, another problem emerged. Two of the triplets, Ben and Francis, had had an argument, and neither turned up. The other triplet, Jack, reported what had happened. Both Ben and Francis had bought goldfish at the weekend, he said. Ben had bought a big goldfish that he'd called the Gobbler, while Francis had got a smaller fish that she'd named Michael Owen after the Liverpool striker.
"Michael Owen?" Dan queried. "Why did you call it Michael Owen?" "She said it moved really fast like Michael Owen," Jack said. "And anyway, she likes Michael Owen."
"Huh," Sam snorted, flicking back her fringe fiercely.
"Tommy Banks is better than Michael Owen any day." "Yeah, we know you love Tommy Banks," sighed Dan.
but we still don't know what's up with Ben and Francis."
All eyes turned to the oldest of the triplets again. Small spots of pink appeared on his pale cheeks, and his blue eyes were bright with the importance of his news.
"Well, the thing is," he continued animatedly, "that when we came down to breakfast this morning, there was only one goldfish in the bowl."
He paused and raised his hand dramatically.
"It seems like the gobbler ate Michael Owen."
This news, tragic as it may have been for the consumed goldfish's owner, reduced the twins to a fit of giggles.
"The gobbler ate Michael Owen!"
squealed Giles.
"Gobble, gobble, gobble!"
cried Justin, demonstrating how he thought the dirty deed had been done.
"It's not funny, though," said Jack. "Frances is really upset. She said Ben's fish was a disgusting cannibal, and Ben said her fish was stupid, and he was glad the gobbler had eaten it. And now they're not talking to each other."
Dan frowned and shook his head.
"So now we're down to 8 players," he said bitterly, "and all because of a couple of goldfish."
He sighed deeply.
"Let's hope they make up by Saturday." "At least they'll be on opposite sides of the pitch," remarked the triplets' older sister, Zoe.
"Yeah," Dan agreed wearily,
"but will they both be on our side?"
Another matter was concerning Sam.
"We still haven't decided who's going to take Gabby's place in goal," she reminded her brother.
"I don't mind playing in goal," shrugged Rollo.
"No, we need you up front, Rollo,"
Dan said firmly.
"I'll play in goal,"
cried Giles and Justin at the same time.
"You can't both play in goal," said Sam. "I'll be goalie first half," said Giles. "And I'll be goalie second half," added Justin. "No one will beat us," Giles declared confidently. "No way," Justin affirmed.
The two boys each mimed a spectacular dive, tumbling into each other and collapsing noisily on the floor. Dan raised his eyes to the ceiling and sighed. Chapter 8. A Chapter of Errors. On Saturday morning, Dan phoned up Drayton Park to see if the superintendent had any news about their ball. It was a long shot, he knew, and he wasn't at all surprised to be told that the ball still hadn't been found.
"We've had a card from the janitor, though,"
said the superintendent cheerfully, and Dan's spirits rose a little.
"What did he say?"
he asked, pressing the receiver tighter to his ear.
"Well,
the superintendent continued wheezily,
he says he's having a wonderful time. The sun's been shining every day, and the swimming pool's lovely. Yesterday, he went on a coach trip to an old monastery and had his feet washed, but he doesn't think much of the food." "But what about the ball?" Dan interrupted impatiently. "What does he say about our ball?" "Your ball?" the superintendent muttered quizzically. "He's in Ibiza. Why would he be writing about your ball?"
He coughed raspily.
"I told you before," he said. "You'll have to wait till he comes back to ask him about your ball."
Dan sighed. "Okay," he said.
"But what day does he come back exactly?" I'm not sure," breathed the superintendent. "Sunday, I think." "Are you sure it's not Saturday?" Dan gasped pleadingly.
He couldn't bear the thought of Archie missing Legs United's match against the Colts. That was a game they absolutely had to win.
"It may be," said the superintendent vaguely. "All I know is he'll be back next weekend. I suggest you phone again then."
"Okay. Thanks," Dan said with a gloomy air. There was no time to dwell on this latest setback, for there was the match against Lympton to think about. The good news was that Ben and Francis were both going to play. Their parents had insisted. The bad news was that they still hadn't made up. The twins had offered Frances one of their stick insects as a substitute for her gobbled goldfish, but she'd declined. A stick insect wasn't a real pet like a goldfish was, she'd remarked huffily. The feud between Ben and Francis seemed to affect the whole team. There was an uneasy, tetchy atmosphere among the Legs United players as they gathered on the pitch that afternoon. It wasn't the easiest of circumstances in which to give a first-ever team talk, but Dan did his best.
"OK, everyone," he said with a heartiness he didn't actually feel. "Let's put all our problems behind us and really go for it. If Archie was here, he'd probably tell us some inspiring story about Herbert Chapman and Arsenal. But all I can say is that we're going to have to try twice as hard as normal to make up for being a player short. It's going to be tough, but we can do it, can't we?"
The response was not the rousing chorus he'd hoped for, more a muted selection of mumbles and grunts. But at least it was a generally approving response. No one told him to shut up or go and stick his head in a bucket. However, later that afternoon, that was just about what he felt like doing. At first, things went okay for Legs United. Their 10 players matched the 11 of Lympton with admirable skill and determination. As Dan had urged, the team put in a sterling effort. In midfield and defence, they chased and harried and denied the Lympton players space. Billy ran his heart out, and even Sam made a few tackles, which was almost unheard of. Up front, though, Ben and Francis were definitely not on their game. They stood out on their wings as far apart as possible, almost hugging the touchlines on either side of the pitch. When Sam tried to bring her cousins into play by hitting passes over the top of the Lympton defence for them to run onto, she got only a half-hearted response. The two wingers, who were usually so quick, trotted forward lethargically and failed to get to a single pass. For nearly half an hour of the match, Legs United held firm and actually looked the more dangerous of the two sides, but then things suddenly started to go badly wrong. The first Lympton goal came as the result of an awful mistake. A lucky ricochet off a Lympton player sent the ball spinning into the Legs United half, where it dropped into the path of their central striker. Even so, there should have been no problem, for he was a long way from the Legs United goal and still had Dan to get past. As it happened, though, he didn't even attempt to do that. Instead, he looked up and then lofted the ball high in the air towards the goal. Dan turned untroubled, expecting to see Giles collect the ball and kick it back upfield. But what he actually saw, to his horror, was Giles upside down doing a handstand.
"Giles!" he screamed. "Look out!"
But his cry came too late and had the opposite effect he'd intended. Instead of springing up to save the ball, Giles tumbled and sprawled face down in the mud, raising his head just in time to watch the ball bounce by him into the unguarded net. Lympton were in the lead. 5 minutes later, they got a second, and this time it was Dan himself who scored it. Jumping to head the ball away from a corner, he mistimed his leap, and the ball banged against the back of his head and flew into his own net. Giles didn't have a chance. It was Lympton 2, Legs United 0. Worse was to follow in the second half. First, Justin somehow managed to let a gentle shot roll between his legs to give Lympton their third goal, and then he and Giles collided in the penalty box to allow the Lympton central striker to score easily into an empty net. As if this wasn't disaster enough, Zoe tripped and twisted her ankle, and Legs United had to play the last 10 minutes with only 9 players, and one of those, Billy, was so exhausted he could barely stand up. It was amazing that they managed to keep the score to just 4-0. Even so, it was easily the worst defeat Legs United had ever suffered. Trudging off at the end, the Legs players looked utterly dejected. On the touchline, their parents were equally sombre and subdued. The contrast in mood from the previous Saturday was enormous. The last to leave the field, Dan had the longest face of all. What would Archie have said, he thought, if he'd seen his team play so badly? He pictured the phantom footballer alight with outrage. But then, he reflected, if Archie had been there, Legs United wouldn't have lost as they had. He would have come up with a plan to save the game, wouldn't he? He always did. They needed Archie. Oh, where was Archie? Chapter 9. Down and Up. The more he thought about it, the more Dan was sure that he was to blame for the state Legs United were in. After all, he was the one who had lost the ball in the first place. Then, as captain, he had failed to lift his team when it had mattered. He'd even contributed to their defeat by scoring an own goal. That Sunday morning, he was feeling about as low as could be. "I think perhaps someone else should take over as captain," he suggested defeatedly to Sam at breakfast that morning. Sam wrinkled her nose thoughtfully. "You can't give up now," she said with a decisive shake of her head. "Archie chose you as captain. You've got to go on."
Her green eyes narrowed with determination. "Archie will be back soon, and then everything will be fine," she added hopefully. Dan didn't look convinced. "But what if the janitor doesn't know where the ball is? What if Archie really is lost?" he said miserably, tugging at his ear. Sam shrugged. "I don't know," she replied grimly. "All we can do is hope and do our best." Sam's positive words failed to lift her brother's spirits. He gazed into his cereal bowl as if it was a deep black hole that might at any moment suck him in. "Look, why don't we go down to the meadow for a quick kickabout?" Sam proposed. "We need to get out of the house." "Yeah, okay," Dan agreed wearily. He didn't really feel like playing football, but it was a more appealing prospect than moping around the house all day. They walked down the garden to the fence at the bottom, Sam leading. Dan was still climbing over when he saw his sister jolt to a stop. "Hey, look at that!" Sam shouted. She pointed across at the fence on the opposite side of the meadow. Standing beside her now, Dan followed her finger and gasped. The fence was covered in graffiti. "Legs United are rubbish. 4-0. 4-0. Had been sprayed untidily across the wood in huge, chunky letters. Dan stared irately at the graffiti. "Who could have done that?" Sam cried perplexedly. But Dan knew at once who was responsible. "It was Perry," he declared angrily. "I know it was. He must have found out about our defeat and come down here last night to rub it in. I bet his stupid brother helped him." A picture came into his head of George and Perry Nolan sniggering as they scrawled their mocking message. Dan's hackles rose. Gloomy resignation had been replaced now by resentment and a burning desire for revenge. "We're not going to let them get away with this," he hissed. "We'll get our own back on Saturday," Sam said fiercely. Dan nodded. His hands bunched into fists as he glared at the graffiti. "First, though, we've got to get rid of this rubbish," he growled. "No one's ruining our ground." "No," Sam agreed. She thought for a moment, then said, "Let's go and ask Otis the best way to get it cleaned up. He'll know." They sprinted off to speak to Zach's dad. It was Zach himself who answered the door. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "Oh, hi, Zach," said Dan. Sam said nothing. Her face froze in shock as she took in the puffy blisters on Zach's skin. "You look awful," Sam said at last. "Oh, no," said Zach easily. "I'm getting better. Mum says. She reckons I'll be fine to play on Saturday." "But what about those things on your face?" Sam persisted. "You get these near the end," Zach assured her. "When the red spots have gone." "That's great," Dan enthused, grateful for any good news. "What about Gabby?" he added tentatively. Zach frowned. "She's still covered in red spots," he said grimly. "Oh," sighed Dan. At least Zach would be back, though, he thought, as they went to find Zach's dad. Otis advised them to paint over the graffiti. They'd never scrub it off, he said. He gave them 2 pots of paint and some brushes. "Good luck, guys," he said. Zach went with Sam and Dan, and the 3 of them spent the rest of the morning painting. It was hard work, but when they'd finished, the fence looked smart and clean, and there was no sign of the graffiti. They sat down for a while and admired their work in silence. Sitting between Sam and Zach, Dan felt a sudden rush of happiness at having his best friend around again. Things finally seemed to be looking up, though there were still problems to sort out. "We've got to get Ben and Francis to make up," he said at last. "Yeah," Sam agreed. "But how?" "If only Archie were here," Zach mused wistfully. "He'd find a way." Zach was right, Dan thought. Archie would have found a solution. But Archie wasn't here, so it was up to him as captain to sort things out. After a bit, he said, "I think I might have an idea." The others looked at him keenly. "You know Francis really likes Michael Owen," he ventured. "Yes," snorted Sam dismissively. "Well, there's a big pull-out poster of him in the middle of my magazine," Dan went on. "Supposing I give it to Ben to give to Francis, like a kind of peace offering." It might work," said Zach uncertainly. "I think we should try," said Sam, tossing her head decisively. As it happened, Ben was quite happy to go along with Dan's scheme. A week had gone by since his falling out with Frances, and he had no wish for the feud to continue. Frances, too, was tired of the situation, and she accepted happily the olive branch of the poster. She didn't say so to Ben, but she actually preferred the poster to her goldfish. She put the picture of Michael Owen up on her wall next to a pop star poster that Zoe had given her. "You know, Dan, that was a really good idea," Sam congratulated her brother later. "Thanks," Dan said contentedly. "In fact," Sam added, "it was a touch of genius, as Archie would probably say." And the two of them laughed. Finally, it seemed, Legs United were getting back on their feet again. Chapter 10. Twice the Team. The next few days were good ones for Dan and Legs United. Hard on the heels of Ben and Frances' reconciliation came the good news that Zoe's ankle had fully recovered and she'd be okay to play against the Colts. The following day, a spotless Zach reported fit too. The only doubt now hung over Gabby. Her spots had moved from the red to the blistery stage, but it was touch and go whether they'd all have scabbed over and gone by Saturday. Dan thought it was important for team morale that Gabby should come to the training session he'd called for Friday afternoon, but Zach seemed doubtful whether she would. "She's really upset about how she looks," he warned his best friend. "Since she got chickenpox, she hasn't gone out at all. She says she looks like a monster." Muttered Dan, and his brow creased in thought. "You've got to get her to come." Suddenly, his face lit up. "Tell her we've got a special surprise for her," he exclaimed. "What surprise?" Zach asked, puzzled. "Well, you'll see," said Dan mysteriously, and he tapped a finger to his nose in an Archie-like gesture. Gabby took some cajoling, but Zach did eventually manage to persuade her to accompany him to the meadow that afternoon. She appeared dressed in a hooded top tied tightly at the neck, so that little more than her eyes were visible. But they bulged with astonishment at the sight that confronted them. The faces of every single member of the team were covered in spots. "Eh?" said Gabby, gaping at her teammates in utter amazement. Zach, too, was shocked. What's going on?" he queried anxiously. Dan licked his finger and smudged one of the spots into a blob. "It's okay," he laughed. "It's only felt tipsy. I thought it would make Gabby feel better if we were all spotty too." Gabby shook her head and grinned. Then, throwing back her hood, she joined in with the others. She very quickly seemed to forget about her chickenpox as she dived and leapt and twisted. In fact, as Dan noticed happily, she hardly had any spots now at all. It was a very successful training session. Not that anything brilliant was taught or learnt, as it probably would have if Archie had been in charge, but the team spirit was excellent. For just about the first time since losing their manager, the Legs United players laughed together. They were a real team once more. Spirits were still high next afternoon, when Dan prepared to give his second ever team talk. Gabby's presence, now spotless like her brother and raring to go, was a massive boost. The twins' goalkeeping against Limpton had been eccentric, to say the least. In Gabby, the Muddington Colts would meet a much surer and more formidable barrier. Dan began his talk by reminding everyone of Perry Nolan's graffiti attack on the meadow. Then he recalled the previous match between the two teams in the summer, when Perry and his dad, Holt Nolan, who'd refereed that day, had tried to cheat Legs United out of a deserved victory. He didn't really need to say any more. Everyone was really up for this game, he could tell. Somehow, though, it didn't feel like a proper team talk if there was no mention of Herbert Chapman or Arsenal. As he stood there, he recalled something Archie had once told him. He drew himself up Archie-like. "As the great Herbert Chapman once said of the Arsenal centre-back Herbie Roberts," he declaimed grandly, "there goes two players. Well, I say that about Zach and Gabby." He paused dramatically. "But they are two players," Sam pointed out. "Yes, well," Dan mumbled, "you know what I mean. Last week, without Zach and Gabby, we were badly beaten. Today, with them, we will be twice the team, and the Colts won't stand a chance."
This time, his statement was met by a loud whoop of appreciation. "Right, let's get out and play," Dan urged. Legs United were warming up in the meadow when the Muddington Colts arrived. They drew up in 2 flashy limousines provided by Holt Nolan, who liked to show how rich he was. There was a cocky air about the visitors as they walked into the Legs United ground. Perry Nolan strode in as if he owned the place and cast a quick, smirking glance across at the fence where the graffiti had been. "Found your ball yet, then?" he jibed as the referee called Dan forward for the toss-up. "No," Dan hissed fiercely, "but we don't need it, not against you lot." "Huh," sneered Perry. "We'll see, won't we?" As the 2 teams lined up for the kickoff, Dan could feel the bond of determination and family pride that ran through his team. They might be missing their coach, but they were certainly not lacking spirit. From the start, Muddington Colts were pushed back in their own half as Legs United swept forward. Only stout resistance by George Nolan and his fellow defenders kept the home side at bay. Perry Nolan, as usual, did nothing to help his defence. While Legs United attacked, he just hung about in the Legs half, waiting for someone to pass to him so that he could grab the glory. For most of the first half, he was little more than a spectator. When Zach scored with a scorching volley, it seemed like the Colts would be totally overwhelmed. But somehow they held out, and when the ref's whistle blew for half-time, the score was still 1-0. Dan was a little disappointed that Legs United's pressure hadn't brought more goals, but he was pleased with the way the team had performed. "Well played, everyone," he congratulated his fellow players as they walked towards the touchline. The next instant, though, it was something off the pitch that took his attention. A voice shouting. He turned to see a man coming through the gateway into the meadow. The man was large and bald-headed, with a deep tan.
"Are you Legs United?"
he asked. "Yeah, that's us," said Dan with a tug of his ear.
"Ah, good,"
the man sighed. He put down the big canvas bag he was carrying and took out an old leather football.
"I believe this is yours," he said.
Chapter 11. A Triumphant Return. The Legs United players couldn't believe their eyes. They stood motionless, goggling at the old ball, as the Drayton Park janitor explained apologetically to Dan that he'd put the ball in a private locked cupboard for safekeeping before he'd gone on holiday.
"I could see it was no ordinary ball,"
he said, looking at the ancient football affectionately.
"They don't make 'em like this anymore."
He handed the ball over to Dan. "Thanks," Dan said quietly, still stunned with surprise.
"No problem,"
the janitor replied with a smile.
"Anyway, I'd best be off now back to the park. Good luck with your game."
"Yes, thanks," Dan said again. Then as the janitor hurried away to the gate, Dan turned round and, smiling broadly now, held the ball aloft. At once, his fellow players started shouting and racing across the pitch towards him. The adult Legs joined the stampede. Sam was the first to reach Dan. Without hesitation, she grabbed the ball and began to rub it gently.
"Arise, oh Archie!" she wailed. "Archie, arise!"
And there, fizzing out of the ball like an electrified genie, was Archie.
"Free at last!" he exclaimed.
He glanced around his gathered relatives, and then beyond to where Holt Nolan and the Colts were looking on with a mixture of surprise and ridicule. All they could see was the old ball, because Archie was only visible to his family. Archie's eyes flickered and glowered.
"I see we are entertaining that team of petty chiselers," he said fiercely. "I trust we are winning."
"We are, 1-0, Dan nodded.
"Ah, excellent,"
Archie purred, and his hairy caterpillar eyebrows twitched in a funny sort of dance. Everyone wanted to know what had happened to the Phantom manager. How had he spent the last fortnight? Archie held up his bony hand to demand silence.
"There is very little to tell," he proclaimed with a waggle of his moustache. "All I can say is how wonderful it is to be out in the real world again, after spending 2 weeks inside a pig's bladder with that wretched greengrocer whispering in my ear about the price of cauliflowers and how many King Edward potatoes you get to the pound."
He breathed deeply.
"Now," he boomed, I think you had better inform me of what I have missed.
Quickly, Dan, with help from the others, sketched in the events of the past fortnight, concluding with the first half of the match against the Colts. Archie tutted at the Limpton result, and his outline flared with outrage at the news of Perry Nolan's graffiti attack, but his face relaxed into a smile as he heard about the team's recovery.
When Herbert Chapman died in January 1933, his team experienced a similar collapse, Archie reflected soberly. Top of the league at the time, Arsenal suffered 3 consecutive defeats, but, like you, they recovered. Indeed, they went on to win the title for a 3rd successive year.
He paused a moment and regarded his team fondly.
I am proud of you all,
he declared, his face beaming. At that moment, the referee's whistle blew to summon the players for the second half.
Is there anything you want to say to us?
Dan asked eagerly. But Archie shook his large head.
You seem to be doing fine already, he replied warmly. Just go out and play.
If Legs United were good in the first half, in the second they were irrepressible. Archie's reappearance inspired them to new heights of performance. The passing was crisper, the moves more pacey and imaginative, the effort even greater. Muddington Colts were pressed back once more. Strangely, though, it was the away team who scored first. A long clearance found Matt Blake, who cleverly put Perry Nolan in on goal, one-on-one with the keeper. A brilliant diving save by Gabby denied Perry, but the ball fell to Matt, who slammed home the rebound. Perry Nolan celebrated like it was the winning goal in the cup final.
I told you were rubbish, he taunted Dan.
Dan ignored Perry, but inside he was seething. On the touchline, Archie was glowing like a Guy Fawkes bonfire, but like his captain, he said nothing. He stood with one foot on the old ball, arms folded, glaring. Legs United played like a team possessed now, running their opponents ragged. It seemed only a matter of time before they'd get another chance to score. And so it turned out. Just minutes after Muddington Colts scored their equaliser, Zach latched on to a fine through ball from Sam to fire the home team ahead again. Moments later, Zach repaid the compliment, laying the ball back for Sam to run onto and smash an unstoppable shot past the keeper. Legs were 3-1 up. The barrage continued. Ben hit the bar. Francis had a hard shot turned over by the goalkeeper. Zach put a couple of shots just wide. At the heart of the Colts' defence, George Nolan was looking more and more agitated. When Legs United won a corner near the end of the match, he finally turned on his younger brother.
Perry! He screamed. Get back here, you lazy lump, and help us out!
Sulkily, Perry trotted back into his own penalty area and stood in front of Dan, not attempting to mark him properly. Sam took the corner. It was a wicked in-swinger, curling in from the right towards the centre of the goal, where Dan was already leaping. He leant forward to head the ball, but it never reached him. Perry put up a hand and flicked the ball away. The referee's whistle blew immediately.
Penalty,
he said, and he pointed to the spot.
Referee!
Perry protested, arms raised in innocence, but no one supported him. George Nolan swore and shoved him angrily towards the edge of the penalty area. Sam placed the ball on the penalty spot as if to take the kick, but instead she turned to Dan.
It's all yours, bro,
she said matter-of-factly.
Me? Dan queried. But I'm a defender. I'm no good at penalties.
Sam shrugged.
Doesn't matter. We're going to beat them anyway.
She walked away towards the penalty D.
Good luck,
she called over her shoulder. Dan took a deep breath. Then he too walked to the edge of the penalty area. Sam was right, he thought. They were going to win whether he scored or not. But how sweet it would be to score a penalty given away by Perry. It would be the best revenge of all. Glancing across at Archie, he received a curt nod of encouragement. Then he turned back to face the goal. The whistle peeped. Dan took a small hop, then sprinted forward. He didn't quite connect with the ball as cleanly as he'd have liked, but it didn't matter. The ball skidded into the right-hand corner of the goal, with the keeper going the other way. As the ball hit the back of the net, Dan raised his head and his hands in jubilation. He'd scored! Legs United had won, and best of all, their phantom manager was back. Chapter 12. New Boots. "There's a parcel for you," Anne Legg informed Dan when he came down to breakfast on Monday morning. "The postman just delivered it." "For me?" Dan said, bemused. "Whatever can it be?" He only got parcels on his birthday, and it was a long time till then. "Let's go and see," Sam exclaimed excitedly. She leapt up from the table and ran out into the hall. Dan followed her. The package was on the hall table. It was quite a large box covered in brown paper. Sam picked it up and thrust it at her still dozy brother. "Open it, then," she urged. Dan tugged at the paper, ripping it open. An envelope fell out. But his eyes weren't really interested in that. What they were staring at was the box that he'd unwrapped. He knew what it contained from the picture on the side, but he couldn't believe it was true until he lifted the lid and saw what lay there. A pair of brand-new, beautiful, yellow football boots, nestling in tissue paper. "Wow!" he cooed. "Wow!" With trembling fingers, he lifted out the boots and held them up for Sam to see. "They're brilliant!" Sam enthused. "Really cool!" Dan bent down and picked up the fallen letter. Opening it quickly, he read the brief note of congratulation. "I've won the Spot the Ball competition," he said happily. "So Archie was right." "Let's go and tell him," said Sam. "Yeah, and show him my new boots," Dan added. They scuttled off to the sitting room, where the old ball was now back in its proper place in the glass cabinet. Sam took it out and summoned her ghostly relative. Archie wasn't at all surprised at the children's news. In fact, he was a little put out that they should have doubted his solution. "Sorry, Archie," Dan apologised. "It just seemed such an odd place for the ball to be, down under their feet when they were jumping in the air." "Ah," said Archie, with a conceited wiggle of his moustache. "Always expect the unexpected. That way you stay one step ahead." "Well, I guess we can't all be geniuses like you," Sam said with a freckly grin. "No, that's true," Archie agreed smugly. "One grapefruit in the family is probably enough." Sam and Dan sniggered. "I mean, one genius," Archie swiftly corrected himself. "That infernal greengrocer has got me spouting all manner of nonsense." "Sprouting, don't you mean?" Dan joked. Very amusing," Archie remarked tartly. "But honestly, Archie, how did you know where the ball was?" Dan persisted. Archie raised one bushy red eyebrow. Well, actually, I saw it." "You saw it?" Sam exclaimed. "Yes, indeed," Archie nodded. "It's one of the gifts we spirits have. They removed the ball from the picture, but I could still see it, glowing faintly, rather like a ghost, I suppose." "So it wasn't genius after all," Sam remarked pointedly. "Yes, well, not exactly," Archie hummed. He coughed and quickly changed the subject. "Now, let's have a look at those new boots of yours," he said. Dan handed the boots over. He hoped his ancient relative would like them, but he didn't really expect him to, because they were so different from Archie's own clumpy brown steel toe-capped pair. He was sure Archie wouldn't approve of the yellow. He was wrong, though. Archie sighed rapturously. "When Herbert Chapman was a player, he wore yellow boots," he explained in a quiet, affectionate tone. "He was always ahead of his time." "Tommy Banks wears red boots," said Sam dreamily. "Yeah, so does Paddington Bear," Dan laughed. Sam glared at him. "Oh, well," Archie murmured, "yellow or red. I suppose there's one thing to be said for wearing colourful boots." "What's that?" asked Dan and Sam together. "Well," said Archie with a glowing smile, "you may lose the ball, but you'll never lose your feet."
That was Legs United, Up for the Cup and Spot the Ball by Alan Durant, read by Richard Mitchley.